Ahora sí. Buenas tardes, bienvenidas, bienvenidos al 20º Seminario Internacional del Boletín Informativo Techint en forma presencial y con streaming en vivo. Antes de comenzar, veremos un video de seguridad.
Bienvenidos al Convention Center. Durante su estadía queremos brindarle los elementos de seguridad para el correcto desarrollo de sus actividades. Usted se encuentra en el auditorio principal. El edificio está equipado con los siguientes elementos de seguridad: botiquín de primeros auxilios, desfibrilador electrónico automático, avisador de incendios, extintores, mangueras contra incendio y salidas de emergencia para una rápida evacuación. En caso de incendio, recibirá la orden de evacuación a través del sistema de audio. Diríjase a la salida más cercana y siga las indicaciones del líder de piso, que estará allí para asistirlo en todo momento. Se lo guiará hacia la salida de emergencia y posteriormente al punto de encuentro. Ante una urgencia, el edificio cuenta con un servicio de emergencias médicas. De necesitarlo, solicítelo en planta baja. Muchas gracias por su atención. Le deseamos una agradable estadía en el Convention Center.
Bueno, el tema que trataremos hoy, industrialización, comercio y aranceles, un mundo con nuevas reglas de juego, oportunidades y desafíos para la Argentina. Las exposiciones estarán a cargo de Robert Lighthizer, Dani Rodrik y Juan Carlos Hallak. El seminario se desarrollará en inglés y en español. Aquellos que nos acompañan en forma remota podrán optar por seguirlo en idioma original o traducido al español. Y en el caso de los asistentes se encontrarán los receptores en la entrada del auditorio, en el canal 3 inglés, en el canal 4 español. En la primera parte del seminario contaremos con la presentación de Robert Lighthizer y luego un diálogo con el doctor Paolo Rocca. Debido a los compromisos de su agenda, el doctor Lighthizer se retirará al final de este primer panel. Luego haremos un break de media hora y en la segunda parte tendremos las exposiciones de Dani Rodrik y Juan Carlos Hallak. Finalmente, pasaremos a una sesión de preguntas y respuestas con la moderación de Gerardo Della Paolera y los asistentes por streaming podrán enviar sus preguntas, como lo hacen habitualmente, a través del formulario que encontrarán debajo del reproductor. A continuación, el ingeniero Javier Martínez Álvarez, director del Boletín Informativo Techint, realizará la apertura del seminario. Muchas gracias.
Hola. So first, let me extend a warm welcome to our esteemed guests from abroad to this, our 20th seminar of the Techint Boletin. I'm going to switch to Spanish now, so my apologies for the benefit of the larger audience. Bueno, bienvenidos a todos. Hace 20 años nos preguntábamos cómo insertarnos mejor en el proceso de globalización. Hoy estamos inmersos en la incertidumbre, en un mundo afectado por conflictos bélicos, la globalización se ha fragmentado y la gobernanza internacional se debilita aceleradamente. Este proceso se explica en gran medida por el comportamiento de China, desde el momento de su incorporación en la OMC. La esperanza de que ello contribuiría a la liberalización de su sistema político y a la adopción de medidas económicas de libre mercado se vio frustrada. Su extraordinario crecimiento y su vocación hegemónica se fundamentan en gran medida en la violación de las reglas del sistema económico internacional. La reacción más potente a este nuevo contexto ha sido la de los Estados Unidos, a la que también se sumaron Europa y otros países avanzados. ¿Cuáles son los desafíos que se abren para las economías emergentes y en especial para América Latina? Integrarse a un mundo cada vez más complejo requiere creatividad y sofisticación. De esto hablarán nuestros distinguidos invitados, quienes nos presentarán distintos puntos de vista. El embajador Robert Lighthizer, quien ha tenido un rol fundamental en el diseño de la política comercial de Estados Unidos frente a China, como lo refleja en su libro No Trade is Free, hará referencia a la política comercial que está implementando Estados Unidos para revigorizar su industria manufacturera, no solo por el impacto económico y estratégico, sino también por la dimensión social. El doctor Dani Rodrik profesor de la Universidad de Harvard, se referirá a las posibilidades de la industria de los países emergentes en el contexto global. El doctor Carlos Hallak, finalmente, profesor de la Universidad de Buenos Aires y con experiencia en la función pública como expresidente de la Comisión Nacional de Comercio Exterior, nos aportará su visión acerca de cómo puede impactar todo esto en Argentina. Reitero mi saludo a los asistentes, presenciales y virtuales, y los invito a participar de este espacio de diálogo y aprendizaje. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, ingeniero Martínez Álvarez. A continuación, el doctor Robert Lighthizer desarrollará el tema política, comercial e industria y luego tendrá un diálogo con el doctor Paolo Rocca. El doctor Lighthizer fue representante comercial de los Estados Unidos durante el primer gobierno del presidente Trump entre el 2017 y el 2021, a cargo de la renegociación del TEMEC y de los acuerdos comerciales con Corea del Sur, Japón y China en su fase 1. Anteriormente trabajó en el sector privado y ocupó cargos en el gobierno del presidente Reagan, participando en acuerdos comerciales sobre acero, automóviles y productos agrícolas. Es doctor en jurisprudencia por la Universidad de Georgetown, autor del libro No Trade is Free y reconocido disertante y autor en temas de comercio, política e historia de los Estados Unidos. Doctor Lighthizer, lo escuchamos.
The only part I understood of any of that was Robert Lighthizer and no trade is free. And it occurred to me that I didn't really need to hear the rest of it, since we got sort of the nub of it right there. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Paolo and all his team for inviting me to be here. I speak not infrequently. And one of the things that induces me to speak is the place, and I love Buenos Aires. You all probably take it for granted because it's your home, but I don't think there's a city in the Americas that has as many spectacular buildings as Buenos Aires does, and I always feel very comfortable here. And when I walk down the streets, I get more a feeling of I don't know quite the delicate way to say this, but of the kind of America of my youth, more than the America that I'm living in now. So thank you for having me, and congratulations on a spectacular city. I was last year with the president when we had the G20, and I had a very memorable dinner with the president and President Xi, in a famous dinner that I won't spend time talking about because then you won't read the book. So I need you to read the book. I want to kind of cover two things today, and then we'll have questions, and I look forward to that conversation. One is the trade predicament that the United States sees itself in, and thus the world sees itself in. And the second is this issue of China and what I consider to be an existential threat from China. But the first and probably broader question is, with all the turmoil in the world, and the United States is kind of leading that turmoil in the trading system, kind of why are we doing it, right? And if you stand back and you don't understand how it looks from our side, it might look irrational or herky-jerky. But I would suggest it's a natural growth out of what has happened in this trading system, and a natural growth out of what happened in the first term of the Trump administration. To me, the international trading system is defunct. It's over. It wasn't without its benefits, but it has evolved now to a point where it doesn't help. For sure, it doesn't help the United States, but I would say it doesn't help a number of other countries throughout the world. And therefore, it has to be replaced. It was a system really based on a fallacy. And that fallacy was that free trade really exists in the world. And it really doesn't exist in the world. And it's not because Adam Smith and David Ricardo were wrong. It's because what they described is not the state of the world now. Economics in those times really was a time, it was a science or an art, depending on whether you're an economist or not. If you're an economist, you think it's a science. If everyone else, you think it's an art. But of scarcity, and that world doesn't really exist anymore. So the obituary is kind of interesting. It really, the trading system as we know it, really began to develop in 1944 when we had Bretton Woods, and we ended up coming out of that agreement with the World Bank and the IMF. And then 3 years later, we had the end of the negotiations in Geneva in 1947 that evolved into the trading system. And we had an international trade organization that the countries of the world, or at least a lot of the countries of the world, agreed to set up. And then the United States Congress objected to the agreement on the grounds that it basically was usurping U.S. sovereignty. And so there was no real agreement. So what the president did at that time is he did an executive agreement, and we ended up then with what was called the GATT, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. And it was not a formal ratified agreement at all for the United States. But it's something that kind of worked reasonably well. We ended up with 9 rounds of negotiations. We started off really negotiating tariff reductions. And then over a period of time, it became apparent that the problem wasn't just tariffs. The problem was non-tariff barriers, and those of you who are sort of in the trade world will remember this kind of evolution. So by the time we got to the Tokyo round in the 70s, we were trying to negotiate non-tariff barriers. I make this point because the fundamental problem with the trading system is not tariffs. The fundamental problem with the trading system is that countries have developed industrial policy which goes way beyond tariffs, the purpose of which is not to export in order to import, which is the notion of free trade. You export in order to import. I export what I make best, and I import what I make second best, not necessarily what you make best. And that by doing that, I get richer, and my people get richer, and you get richer, and your people get richer. But that's not how it evolved. How it evolved was countries used a labor system, a banking system, lack of environmental regulations, a tax system, currency manipulation, and all these kinds of things to develop an industrial policy, the purpose of which was to get richer and to acquire assets at the expense of another country. And I would say also at the expense of your own consumers, because people that are doing that were basically taking resources away from their consumers, giving it to their producers. Their producers had an edge. And then any country that has an open capital system and an open trade system will then have its industrial policy written by countries around the world, because it will then be in a position where its producers are sacrificing and its consumers are doing relatively better, which is not a good system either. So in 1967, on October 11th, which happens to be my birthday, but it isn't. That's the year that Argentina joined the GATT. I say that, but it was not because it was my birthday. They had other reasons. Noticeably, also, in this obituary that I'm writing now for the trading system, in January of 1995, we went and got rid of the GATT, and now we had the WTO, the World Trade Organization. Interestingly, since that time, there has not been a single multilateral trade negotiation. We had a technical one on customs access, but no multilateral trade negotiation. So from 47 till we started the actual WTO, we had 9 rounds, more or less a round going all the time, because they take many years to negotiate. But since then, we've had none. And part of what happened was the notion of the negotiators were, well, we should have a dispute settlement process, which we called, and then an appellate body. And what evolved very quickly was, instead of a negotiating body, which we had for all these decades, we now had a litigation body. So instead of negotiating, people just started suing each other and letting then the appellate body write the rules. So instead of making concessions, you had the appellate body. And that accelerated the disenchantment of the United States for a lot of reasons, but mostly because we got sued more than everyone else. We had the biggest, most open market in the world, but we got sued. I think the Europeans sued us 3 or 4 times as much as they sued China, for example, to give you some sense of how screwy this became. And then the next and sort of penultimate date, the ultimate date being the actual demise in this obituary, is that in December of 2001, we allowed China to join the WTO. And this was the biggest single mistake that we made. And it was, you'll recall, it was sort of a period where we thought that democracy had won and that it was the end of history, and we were very confident that if we let China into the WTO, they would become a democracy and basically a Switzerland with people who eat Chinese food. And it turned out that was completely wrong. That was a total and utter misconception. So from that time forward, we started to see the negative effects of a variety of places, particularly in the United States. And to give you a slightly more perspective, if you think about it from our point of view, the trading system changed dramatically in the 1990s. We did the Uruguay round, which I just talked about, creating the WTO. We let China have permanent most favored nation treatment, and we did NAFTA. So we did 3 things in the 90s based on the sense that democracy and free markets were going to prevail forever. And it turned out the only thing we left out of the equation was human nature and the fact that people were going to take advantage of this system. So we saw a system developed that instead of exporting and already importing, having more or less balanced trade, we had a bunch of countries that had surpluses eternally. Now, the biggest and worst, and probably the one that killed the system, was China. And I'm going to talk about China, as I say, more in kind of the second part of my remarks. But China's not the only one. There's a bunch of countries, Germany being the second biggest one you would think about, who also kind of stacked the deck. You had Japan for decades and decades and decades, although that is changing a little bit now. You had seemingly benign countries like Singapore, the Netherlands, Switzerland, Norway, Denmark also always had trade surpluses. And then you had a variety of countries, the United States, the UK, traditionally Canada, India, France, that always had trade deficits. And this was not how the system was designed to work. This wasn't how the economists told us it would work. They would say if you ran surpluses for a while, your currency would appreciate. You would have trouble exporting. It would be cheaper to import, and you would work towards balance. But that didn't happen. It didn't happen because of industrial policy of a variety of countries. So, and I would say the system, when you look at the data, more or less worked like that for Argentina, because you go through decades of sort of surplus and then a decade of, and of course a lot of things are going on, including things that are economic, things that are affecting the currency, that are having these wild swings in your situation. And commodity prices are a big factor. So there's a lot of things going on. But if you look at least at the data, it seemed to work for Argentina, and it worked for a variety of countries. But it didn't work for the United States. And it got worse and worse and worse, to the point that now we're running trade deficits that in goods, for example, are $1 trillion. And we have had, not that large, but that kind of trend, hundreds of billions of dollars for decades and decades and decades. So what are the effects of that? An economist would tell you, and I'm sure there's plenty of them here who are thinking it, that deficits aren't bad. That they don't really have any negative impact, and so it's interesting to kind of talk through or think through that. What happens when you have a trade deficit, particularly, and I don't mean a deficit one year and a surplus the next, or a deficit with one country and a surplus with another. I mean global, huge, persistent trade deficits over decades. What you're really doing is you're trading the ownership of your country for current consumption. And you're doing it not because of some economic god who's making these decisions, but because of other people's aggressive industrial policy. So in the case of the United States, we are transferring $1 trillion overseas every year now, and I would say the number is probably closer to $1.4 trillion because of a variety of ways that we make mistakes in terms of the way we keep track of our data, in exchange for current consumption. And there's a data point that kind of marks how bad this is, and that's called the net international investment position of a country, okay? And that's a number that says how much, in our case, all Americans own around the world versus how much everyone else owns in America. And as you can imagine, for most of our history, that was a large positive number. But around 2000, it became a negative number. And now that number is a negative $25.5 trillion. $25.5 trillion of non-Americans own in America over what Americans own overseas. It's an astronomical number. And it happens because ultimately those dollars come back and people buy equity, they buy debt, and they buy real estate. And the place where you buy those things with US dollars is in the United States. So the country is poor, and it's not just the $25.5 trillion, it's the future income of $25.5 billion forever. So it's no country other than, I would say, the United States would have ever allowed themselves to do it. And in the case of most countries, their currency adjustments would not have permitted it to happen. And when there was a gold standard, you would have run out of gold, so it couldn't have happened. So this is something that only happens in the case of the United States because there is not this adjustment, and we can talk about why there isn't this adjustment. And only during this kind of time when we have this dollar as the reserve currency. But the net result is a transfer of wealth overseas in return for current consumption of an enormous amount. The other sort of things that suggest the extent to which we have a problem is, one, we have seen slower economic growth in the United States since this time, since this time of the 90s, or if you want to say 2000, when we granted MFN permanently to China. So to sort of make this point, if you think in terms of 20-year increments, from 1960 to 1980, we had economic growth above 3%, 14 years. And if you look from 80 to 2000, we had it again 14 years, up and back, but over 3% in 14 of those years. Since 2000, we have had economic growth above 3% 3 times, and one was COVID, right, which doesn't really count. So we've really had 2 times economic growth above 3%. In the last 25 years, and none in the last 18 or 19 years. So I would suggest, and if you look at GDP growth, obviously most of you know how to calculate it. The last piece of the calculation is net exports, right? Which for us is a negative number, an enormous negative number. So we've had slower economic growth and a transfer of wealth overseas. We've also seen a diminution in the American leadership in innovation. And there's a lot of data points you can look at that. Probably the most significant one is this Australian Strategic Policy Institute keeps track of 64 what they call critical technologies. And if you look 18 or 19 years ago, the United States led China in all but 3 of those. Now China leads the United States in 57 of the 64. And in some cases, they lead by a generation of technology. So, and there are other points we can show. So there's also this effect on slowing of technology dominance. And that, to some extent, follows from losing manufacturing, because technology tends to follow manufacturing. It tends to be, you manufacture, you have your technology where you manufacture. This is not 100%, but it's mostly true. So, and then the last thing I would suggest, which for me is probably the most significant, is if you look at the effects of this system on American workers, the outcomes have been very negative. You've seen the loss of millions of jobs in the manufacturing sector. You have seen wage stagnation for decades in real terms. There was a spike in the first Trump administration, but other than that, there's been basically a fairly flat line. You have seen outcomes for workers, and I'll define workers for this purpose as people with a high school education only. You've seen these people, because of the devastation that's been wrought across America, and many of you, I know you traveled America, you look around, you can't drive through the Midwest without seeing devastated towns. We now have evolved to where people with a high school graduation level only live 8 years shorter lives than people with a college degree. And what kills them? It's what they call the deaths of despair. So it's alcohol, it's drugs, it's suicide. So there are a lot of causes for that, and I don't want to suggest it's all the international trading system, but this trading system, hollowing out these communities, costing us these jobs, and the effects on these workers has had a very negative effect. Kind of like the final point I'll make on this negative effect, it has driven income inequality in the United States to a level we've never seen before. So for the first time in American history, the top 1% has more wealth than the middle 60%. It's never been true in America. In 2000, according to Angus Deaton, who wrote an excellent book on this, in 2000 it was the first time in American history where a child could expect to be neither richer than or live longer than his parents. So we've seen very, very negative consequences from this trading system. And now we're in a position where we have to move forward. I think President Trump did for sure the right thing when he decided to do this unilaterally. As I say, we kind of set the predicate for it in the first administration, where we renegotiated our agreements with Mexico and Canada, our agreement with Korea. We did agreements with Japan and a variety of other countries, but very importantly, we took on and began to challenge China and put tariffs on $380 billion worth of Chinese imports. So the next logical step was to do what I think what the president is doing, and that is putting in place some kind of baseline tariff that will offset this industrial policy that other people have and drive us back towards balance, which, as I say, is our objective. He diagnosed the problem correctly, which is what I say, a transfer of wealth, lack of slow economic growth, technological drag, and bad effects on our neighbors. He picked the right tool, which I believe is tariffs, although there are other ways you could get to that. Warren Buffett years ago suggested that you use import-export certificates, which would also work. Some people have proposed capital access fee, where when you bring money to the United States, you pay a fee. That would also drive us to balance. But the simplest way, I believe, is to use tariffs. We have a long history of tariffs. The whole world has an economic and legal structure to deal with them. So what should a new system look like? I did an article in the New York Times a while ago talking about this. And to me, what we need to do is get countries together that are basically liberal democracies and organize ourselves in a way that we are going to have balanced trade, not necessarily with every country, because doesn't make sense, but globally. And people who have global surpluses would be subjected to tariffs in a way that would bring them down, and people who have deficits would get the benefit of those tariffs. So I think you could structure a new system designed around basically balance, and I would say global balance, not bilateral, and I would say not year by year, but over a period of 2 or 3 years, so that you have a system that basically comes back to what was expected. So that's the fundamental problem that the president faces, and then we all know that he's taking these actions and getting agreement by other countries to try to resolve them and move forward. The second big problem we face, and this is one that's a broader scope, because it's one that you all face as much as we do, is the threat from China. China is, in my view, an existential threat to the United States and to the Western system of democracies. We have what Neil Ferguson calls the second Cold War going on right now. And it's similar to the first Cold War in that we have a communist country who views itself as the rightful leader of the world, views communism as the rightful and future system of the world, and believes we need a Marxist-Leninist totalitarian new organization for the world. That was very much what was motivating the Soviets in the first Cold War, and it is very much what is motivating the Chinese right now. You combine the belief that you are should be the dominant player in the world, and if you're Chinese, for most of their history, they were the biggest economy in the world and the strongest economy in the world. And that was up to about 100 years ago. You combine that with a Marxist-Leninist ideology, and you conclude pretty quickly that it's time for you to sort of spread and create a new hegemony. So let's look at some of the basic facts, and it's not just economics. They have the largest army in the world, the largest navy in the world. They're expanding both at a very rapid pace, far faster than the West. They have militarized the South China Sea in a way we haven't seen since the Second World War. They're building thousands of nuclear silos all across China. They have military bases around the world. They have territorial disputes with India, the Philippines, Vietnam, Japan, and Taiwan. They claim sovereignty over the shoals all throughout the South China Sea. They are paying for the war in the Middle East as well as the war in Ukraine. Both of those are being maintained by Chinese money, and in the case of the Ukraine, also by Chinese technology. And in the case in April, you'll recall there were even a couple of Chinese soldiers that were discovered fighting in Ukraine. They are engaging in espionage around the world, obviously focused on the United States and Western Europe, but all around the world. And then there's this economic war that has been going on that they have been waging for some period of time against the West. And that has a variety of manifestations. The FBI in the United States starts a new espionage case against China every few hours. and has thousands of them going on right now. They have forced technology transfer. They have a closed market. They have an industrial policy designed really to take over markets, lower prices, stifle competition, and then end up creating the country, the company that dominates in that world. If you look at the U.S. Geological Institute identifies 50 critical minerals. China is dominant in almost all of them. In the case of the United States, we are totally dependent on imports for 12 of the 50 and dependent for more than half of our consumption in another 28. So that's 40 of the 50 we're dependent entirely on imports, and particularly in defense related, that tends almost always to be from China. And none of this, as I say, is anything other than a conscious, and I would say clever plan in an effort to exert control, but ultimately to create a new hegemony. The outcomes are bad for companies that find themselves, that believe they can go to China, make a lot of money, and increase their technology. What they have found, almost without exception, is they make money for a period of time, they lose their technology, the Chinese create a competitor, that competitor takes over the Chinese market immediately and then becomes a global competitor. And we all know there's any number of companies that we can talk about that. And the final group of those companies are the auto industry. We're now starting to see exactly the same pattern in the auto industry, where China has gone from a huge net importer of automobiles to a net exporter of 1 million cars a year to a net exporter now of about 7 million cars a year. The outcomes have also been bad for countries that haven't realized this threat. And we all know the term of the debt trap, where China will come in, they'll do infrastructure deals, and they will invest in a country, the country will run up debt, and then they will be obliged to China. And it's not just a rarity, it's Sri Lanka and Pakistan, Djibouti, Zambia, Laos, and I could go on and on and on. Ecuador is a good example here. Angola, and we could go on and on and on. There's a variety of, so it's companies have had bad outcomes and countries have had outcomes, bad outcomes. And the kind of the final thing I would say to kind of make this point is, if you look at China's own words, I mean, one of the great things about China is that they will tell you what they're going to do. It's just always been part of their system because it's so large. Now, you have to have someone who knows Chinese and is willing to dig. But if you look at when Putin and Xi met at the time of their Olympics right before the invasion of Ukraine, they talked about changes not seen in 100 years. That is a reference to the Bolshevik Revolution in what was then Russia, and the beginning of the Soviet Union. That's what they were talking about. If you saw them talk about an unlimited friendship, what they were talking about was this commitment to each other, but also to spread communism around the world. They talk about, and these are their words, prepare for the struggle. And for them, that's the communist struggle between workers and capitalism. That's what they're talking about. It's this dialectic materialism. And they talk about, now a new term they talk about is community of common destiny. And what that is the post-Western economic political system. That's the system dominated by China and dominated by communism. So they're quite clear about what they believe. Now, I know a variety of you in the audience probably are, I'm sure many of you are free traders, and some of you may even be libertarians. I would suggest that, and you have a politician here, I think, who's famously a libertarian. I would suggest that if there is any polar opposite of libertarianism, it is Marxist totalitarian communist system. That is the polar opposite. And that anyone who thinks that the world won't be less free in a communist-dominated world, I would say you ought to sit back and think this through. We are in a competition with China, and they are the most serious competitor we have ever had. I'll give you another point of reference. The economy of Germany and Japan combined was something like 60% of the U.S. economy at the time of the Second World War. China by itself is like 68% of the U.S. economy right now. So they not only are a threat, they are a gigantic threat. And I would suggest, as I mentioned to Paolo, when I think about these things, I think about a speech that in October of 1964 that Ronald Reagan made. And those of you most of you don't look that old, other than you and me. So some of you go home and ask your parents. But it was a speech, the title was A Time for Choosing. And the notion was it was a time now to make a decision as to what side you're going to be on. Were you going to be on the communist side and that expansion, or were you going to be on the side of Western democracies? And I would suggest now is another one of those times. It's the times of choosing, and that choice shouldn't just be made in the United States, and it shouldn't just be made in Western Europe. It has to be made in Argentina, and it has to be made across Latin America. You're not going to have a good outcome if China prevails, for sure. But even in the short term, I would suggest the outcome will not be what you expect if you go down a path of cooperation and believing that you're involved in an economic relationship with communist China. So you let me end there, and we'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor Lighthizer. Invitamos a pasar al doctor Paolo Rocca, presidente del Grupo Techint.
Well, thank you very much, Robert. Very clear, very interesting. Let me tell you also, in line with the sense that we develop over time in our manufacturing industrial endeavor, when we live through the issue, the problem, and the challenges of our supply chain. There has been, since in the last 20 years, been exposed to this pressure, to the increased role and the weight of China. But you mentioned existential threat for China. How this threat could be contained? There are different words to characterize the relation that could be the relation between the United States and China in the future. The word we are hearing are containment, decoupling, in some case confrontation. And when we consider the extent of the expansion of China, there is not only in manufacturing, in the economic growth, but in the area of influence, but also on the military and technology aspect, in some cases also confrontation, because this could be a potential outcome considering the overall geopolitical situation and some of the tension there are, as you were mentioning correctly, in the South China Sea or against Taiwan. Which would be between this containment, decoupling, confrontation, the way the US could imagine the relation with China in the coming years?
So I would say, first of all, the United States has an obligation to try to keep this a Cold War, because the worst possible outcome would be for it to be a hot war. And we have this whole tension with Taiwan, where I'm morally certain that Xi Jinping expects to have Taiwan as integrated into China before he leaves office, but he probably wants to do it as inexpensively as possible. And at least it's conceivable that he's made the decision not to do it during President Trump's presidency. At least President Trump seems to think that. But in terms of the relationship going forward, I espouse something that I call strategic decoupling. And by strategic decoupling, I mean the following. One, we have basically balanced trade. So you do have trade, but it has to be balanced so that you're not transferring wealth to a geopolitical adversary and building up their army and their navy, which is what we're doing now. I could make the case that if you think about trade deficit, direct and indirect, if you think about stolen technology or technology transfer, and if you think about the money from fentanyl and other things that they get, that the vast majority of China's economic growth over recent decades has been a transfer from the United States to China. If you sort of think about the trade deficit of $300 billion, the technology transfer, the government has estimated between $300 billion and $600 billion a year. Indirect trade is probably, whatever the number is, 30 or 40, 50 billion. Who knows how much money they're making on the fentanyl trade, which is having this devastating effect in the United States. So the first thing you have to do is get back to balanced trade, and that means tariffs. The second thing is you have to develop technology totally independently of China, and develop it with the West, with our allies and other countries who are on our side. Third, you have to regulate ingoing and outgoing investment to China, so that in each case it is in the interest of the West or interest of the United States. And that's what I call strategic decoupling. And if you want to get a sense of what that looks like, it is precisely the Chinese approach to the West. The Chinese manipulate trade so as to get giant surpluses, not balanced, but they would never have a deficit. They are developing their own technology independent of the West as a conscious decision, and they've been doing that for a long, long time. But at least since 2006, when they started way before Xi Jinping, when they started the Indigenous Innovation Program, at least that point, you could probably find marks earlier. So they're developed technology entirely independently, and they regulate all the investment that goes in and that goes out, making a decision that is net in China's interest. Not necessarily the interest of the company that's doing it, but in the interest of the Chinese state and its objectives. So for me, what we should do is one, be cognizant of the fact that we're in this second Cold War, and two, have a conscious policy of strategic decoupling. And I find things like de-risking, or as the Obama people talked about, small yard, high fence. I find all these things to be kind of fanciful and not realistic. And the notion in those cases is that you identify certain things that are very important, and then you kind of make sure that China doesn't have access to those. And the problem I have with that is you don't know really what's going to be important in the future by definition. And secondly, I'm not a believer that our fence is all that high. I think that the technology that we're losing are basically holes in the fence. So to me, you need a conscious decision of strategic decoupling, and that the United States should be doing that in cooperation with its allies.
This is a second point for a second question, because you are talking about strategic decoupling. Strategic decoupling, by the word in itself, imply a vision that is not only concerning the United States. Strategic decoupling, to some extent required the decouplings of manufacturing, of military system, of technology, of the allies of the United States also, which is a vision of a decoupling that goes, let's say, beyond the very first circle, that is the US economy. It should go in a more wider space. It could be for the USMCA, Latin America. I mean, there is a scope for imagining a decoupling on a different scale. It looks to me this should be important, because tariffs are rough tools to some extent. In some cases, what we see are application of tariff to an extent that is pursuing a general objective but has collateral damage, because tariff in the end are affecting different countries in different way. You think there could be this could be evolving in a different vision in which strategic decouplings means also reconnecting the supply chain worldwide in a different way, because everything collapsed. But now we have to rebuild some of this supply chain within countries that share values and trust in democracy in a way that is similar to the traditional historical way of the United States. This will imply, let's say, addressing alliance probably in a more strategic thinking from my point. How you think this? You think this is a next stage, or is something will come on its own from manufacturing, repositioning, and so on?
So I think, first of all, that the United States, facing this peril, and President Trump facing this peril, had to act unilaterally. One thing you can't do is face a crisis like this and say, we're going to sit down with 40 people, and when we've all agreed, we're going to act, right? If you do that, then you might as well just say you're defeated and move on, because there's no chance of that working. So I think the president had to and did act unilaterally and had to do, and I think it's good to do it. The second thing is you had to, and once again, we began this process 8 years ago, you have to convince a lot of these countries that there is, in fact, the problem that I articulated. And my own view is that there are kind of three groups of people who look at the China problem. And among serious people who think about it. One are people who think about it, study it, realize the extent of the problem, and believe we need something like strategic decoupling, right? And I'm in that group. The second group are people that look at, study it, and conclude that, well, what could really happen is China could develop into a great democracy, and so there's not really a problem, and let's work with them, and they'll become. And that was a group that was very predominant, as I said in my remarks, in the 90s, and maybe even in the early 2000s, there was a group. That group is the unicorn group, right? There's basically no one in it. If they are, they have a horn in the middle of their head. The third group are the people that look at it, study it, and say there isn't a problem. Now, those people are all invested in China, right? So every one of them is a sellout without any exceptions. So the first thing we had to do was get everyone into group one. Because if you go back 8 years, the notion that the vast majority of you who have thought about this, that we have a crisis and we have to act, that notion was not prevalent 8 or 9 years ago. And I think one of the things that President Trump gets a lot of credit for is convincing the world that there is this problem. But the other thing that helped us convince the world, and probably was even more effective at showing this crisis than we were, was Xi Jinping, right, who has become more and more and more obvious of what he says and how he acts and what he's trying to do. If you go back to Xi Jinping, you would say, hide your power and bide your time, right? That was kind of the notion in those days. Wait, Xi Jinping's view is that now is the time. We have the power. We're going to act. And so I think he's helped to convince a lot of people. So we have to act unilaterally. We had to let other people evolve to the point, and you can see it most dramatically in Europe, where now the leadership in most of the countries in Europe realize there's a serious problem here that has to be taken on. Part of the reason that they see the crisis is because now Chinese exports are all going to Europe, and they're having this economic crisis. So, in my opinion, the next step is to work together with the allies, a few at a time, and then grow the group as people are convinced and as they want to join. And I think you see some of this if you read the kind of, I was going to say read the fine print of the trade deals, but most of the trade deals don't have any fine print because they're not written down. But read the fine print of the press releases about the trade deals. And there is this notion that's constantly in there of, well, if there's product coming in from China, you have a higher tariff, right? In many cases, 40%. There's this kind of notion that we're going to get together and work, on this issue. So I think you're seeing the beginning of sort of the second phase, which is that phase of getting the allies together. And I should make it clear, I'm not suggesting that these countries all get together and then agree not to trade with China, because I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that'll ever happen. But they can get together and say, okay, fine, we are going to have a sensible trade policy with China, which isn't going to transfer a massive amount of wealth. We are going to develop our technology independent of China, and we're going to guard it so that it stays independent of China. And then that we have other, as I say, investment and other policies that are consistent with the countries themselves working and getting closer and integrating. And then the final thing, Paolo, that kind of comes to mind when I think about this is many people have the view that, well, what the United States should do is enter into trade agreements wherein it runs up huge trade deficits by transferring its wealth to other countries, and those countries then like us more. I'm a believer that that's complete nonsense. I don't think there's any reality to that. Now, a good example of that notion early on was TPP, right, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. That was kind of the way they sold it. And I could spend a lot of time talking about it, but the notion is nutty. And it was a bad agreement, and we sidestepped it. So it's not that kind of an agreement. What we need is agreement based on self-preservation and on balance and on shared ideals. And I fundamentally believe that's the direction we're going to be going in. And I think people won't say, I'm with the U.S. and Europe and I'm against China, but what they'll say is, we're going to develop our technology and have these similar policies, and we'll have a relationship with China, but it's not going to be one that's imbalanced or where they lose technology to them.
To some extent, the measure of the success of a strategic decoupling strategy should be the reduction of the share of China in global manufacturing. Today, they reach 35%. If a policy of strategic decoupling is successful for the US and the allies, 10 years from now, the share and position of China should have changed, and US and other countries will have recovered part of the manufacturing worldwide, because this would be an important way of measuring the success of the strategy, and obviously avoiding an open conflict to the extent possible. But in technology, it's different. In technology, artificial intelligence, the transformation of technology is difficult to contain through tariff. It's a different source of imbalance, but also is a field in which competition or containment or confrontation will go on. How you see in technology, in which clearly US has clear advantage, US could design a strategy that to some extent contain also on this ground, the shift of power over time?
So I would say, first of all, let me just comment on the beginning of your question, because I think it's so fundamental. This point that somehow we're all post-industrial and that we don't need manufacturing is a point that I totally reject. And there's a lot of smart people who have that view, and I find it just absolutely utopian. You need manufacturing because that's where the good jobs are for that group of people that we have that can just do those jobs. They're not the best jobs for all of us, but they're best for high school educated people. Secondly, as I said in my remarks, technology is so fundamental, and innovation comes at the spot of manufacturing, and everyone knows this. I had this debate once years ago with one of my aides, and one of the things you can do is you can call anyone when you're in these jobs, like I was in the government. So I said, well, let's call Elon Musk and ask him, right? Why not? So I called him and I said, here's my dilemma. He said, you're completely right. He said, we innovate where we manufacture, and you can see it in his. And this notion of, sort of invented in Cupertino, California, but manufactured in China, more and more the engineers are where they manufacture. So manufacturing is really important. In the case of the United States, then I'm going to get to your question. But in the case of the United States, it's like 11 or 12% of our GDP. It's 20% of our capital outlays. It's like 30% of our productivity increase. It does 90% of the private sector R&D. It employs 80% of engineers. It employs more super STEM than any other person, any other sector. It's responsible for 60% of exports. So I just want to make that point. Anyone who thinks you're post-industrialist, I don't think they're being realistic. Now on this notion of technology, we need, and I think we are seeing, sort of under the radar in the Trump administration, this notion of the need to develop this technology, to spend the money on it. The president believes that tariffs are part of the solution, and he's probably right if applied properly. If you want to get an idea what you should be thinking about in terms of technology, particularly if you think of it in the context of the U.S. versus China, you go to the list of things in Made in China 2025, right, which came out in 2015, and they listed the things right there. It's AI, it's advanced materials, it's pharmaceuticals. You can just sort of see the list right there. I was testifying before the U.S. The House China Committee, and they asked me, like, what should we be focusing on? I said, just open up the book, just Google Made in China 2025. They'll tell you what the things are that they saw, and they were fundamentally right about all of them. And I do think we need more coordination with allies on this, because I think the United States doing it by itself is probably, one, it will take a lot longer, right? But two, you then are making your position as the global leader weaker by not having allies who are involved in your technology. So I mean, I see it as a joint effort. I think the administration has the right sense of urgency. As I say, we'll see more on this as we develop, because, I mean, like one of the obvious areas, we talk about AI, but as semiconductors is clearly one of the most obvious areas. And the president, has a 232 on semiconductors where he's going to focus on that. He's kind of given some hints as to what he's going to ultimately do. But we have to drive that technology and the manufacturing of those products back to the United States and to its allies.
It's very important, but let me tell you, I fully share your view that manufacturing is essential. We need to bring back manufacturing to our country, not only to the States, but to the set of allies, because the values manufacturing, the contribution to the transformation of the community of a country could not be substituted by anything else. So the core of bringing back manufacturing, but it will require this reconnection of the supply chain, reducing the relevance of China in this. Technology goes, let's say, into the way we build technology, the university. I mean, is an area of wide reach in which I share. I think it's very important what you said about the importance of alliance within countries and people that share the same view. I think, Robert, we are getting to our time. It's been very interesting, I think, for me and for all of the people here. So thank you very much, Ambassador. And we are for a break now. We will break here. If you have some final word here, and then we close. But we appreciate very much your statement, and we support it.
It's my pleasure, and I would just say that the twin crises that the United States face were completely predictable, and they were until Trump having a very negative effect. But I would say because of Trump, you will not see a real free trade person run as a serious candidate for national office in the United States in the lifetime of anyone else here convinced. That's how thoroughly we believe the system has not worked for us, and it's a view that's bipartisan in the United States. And I think that this view of the threat from China is also one where there is a bipartisan kind of universal view in the United States that has evolved. And what we need Argentina on our side, and we need steel producers on our side. So thank you all very much.
Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, doctor Lighthizer y doctor Rocca. Los invitamos a pasar ahora un coffee break. Nos encontramos en 30 minutos para continuar con la segunda parte del 20º Seminario Internacional del Boletín Informativo Techint. ¿Estamos para continuar? Bien. Continuamos con el 20º Seminario Internacional del Boletín Informativo Techint en forma presencial y en vivo vía streaming. Les recordamos que si están utilizando los receptores, en el canal 3 se escucharán en idioma inglés y en el 4 en español. Escucharemos ahora al doctor Dani Rodrik, quien expondrá sobre industrialización y crecimiento en el nuevo contexto global. El doctor Rodrik es profesor de Economía Política Internacional en la Harvard Kennedy School, donde codirige el programa Reimaginando la Economía y la Red Economía para una Prosperidad Inclusiva. Actualmente, su área de investigación es el crecimiento económico inclusivo en países desarrollados y en desarrollo. Ha recibido varios premios, entre ellos el Albert Hirschman y el Princesa de Asturias en Ciencias Sociales. Es autor de numerosas publicaciones en desarrollo económico, economía internacional y política económica. Su último libro, de próxima publicación, se titula Prosperidad compartida en un mundo fracturado. Doctor Rodrik, estamos atentos a su exposición.
Good afternoon. It's wonderful to be here and back at Techint. We're holding this meeting, obviously, at a moment in in the global economy, which is full of uncertainty, and we're looking for answers, and we're looking for paths out. We're trying to make sense of what's happening in the US and in the rest of the world. I'm mostly an optimist, and so I'm going to try to draw a picture which I think is a little bit more optimistic than perhaps it's sane to be at this point. But I do think that it's possible to achieve some of our major objectives in the world economy without necessarily putting them in an extremely conflictual zero-sum frame, especially in regard to the relationship between the United States and the West on the one hand and China on the other. I don't know if Robert is back in the audience, but sort of as I was listening to him, I wistfully remember that in meetings like this, I used to be the radical. And I'm going to be the moderate in this discussion. I'd like to think that's sort of partly because the world has changed and the world has moved much more to the kinds of things that I used to argue for. But I think it's important to diagnose both very well how we got here and also how we're going to get out of it. Because I don't think we can replay history. I don't think we can go back and try to recreate the kind of economies that we had, and that I don't think the Cold War, in particular with the Soviet Union, provides a good image or a desirable image of where we want to be, partly because, of course, the economies of the Soviet Union and the West were nowhere near as entangled as China's is with respect to in the world economy. I'm not a national security expert, but I would have to say that I think the jury is out on how malign an actor in geopolitics China is at the moment. And I do think that a lot of the economic strategy that China pursues actually has enormous positive spillovers for the rest of the world as well. So it's not, I just don't see it in a very zero-sum way. And some of that I will make clear in my presentation. We're, of course, as I said, we're in a moment of transition. Old ideas have gone. We're not going back to hyper-globalization or neoliberalism. I think in that what Robert Lighthizer said is exactly right, that I don't think we're going to see a free trading U.S. Administration anytime soon. It's important to note that, of course, the Biden administration has already made that departure before Trump too. So it's not just a Trump shock, but it's also a fundamental change in the way that the U.S. is seeing its relation to the world economy. At the same time, I think there are severe, the political parallel to that, of course, is the rising authoritarianism, which I think is a major concern. It's a concern today in the United States. I'll have to say that if the U.S. were really serious about creating a robust, attractive democratic model, along with other Western nations, European, Latin American nations, to become a beacon for the rest of the world against Chinese authoritarianism, I'm afraid the Trump administration is doing a very, very poor job of that at the moment, both in terms of its current internal actions as well as in its dealings with its major allies, other democratic allies. So there's a very deep contradiction here in terms of whether there is a real strategy or not. Now, I'd like to organize our challenges using this triangle, which I think highlights what I think are the three major things that we want to achieve all at the same time. And often the stuff that we do, policymakers do, I think come at sort of prioritize some at the expense of the other. And I think we want a world in which we can achieve all at the same time. I think there wasn't much talk about climate change, but I think you will all agree with me that climate change is the greatest threat to our existence at the moment. So any configuration of policies that doesn't take that into account is addressing climate change. It's going to fall very short. Now, the top one on sort of rebuilding the middle class is the leg of this triangle that refers to the erosion of democracy and how we need to rebuild it. I think the weakening of the middle class under hyperglobalization, the deepening of divisions between the losers and the winners under neoliberalism, and the disappearance of good jobs has been critically linked to the erosion of democracy. So I think if we want to sustain democracy in our societies, we'll have to pursue policies that are going to reinforce the middle class. And that's going to come essentially not by social safety nets or income transfers, by actually creating good middle class jobs. So what I want to also say a lot about is how do you create good middle class jobs, because it's only then that you can strengthen the middle class and you strengthen and make democracy sustainable. So I think if climate change is the greatest threat to our physical existence, I think the weakening and erosion of the middle class in recent decades has been the greatest threat to our social and political life. And I think I view it at sort of, almost as important. And of course, we want to ensure that we live in a world that is hospitable to the developmental aspirations of low-income countries, developing countries, as well as middle-income countries, such as Argentina, where there's still considerable poverty. So we want a world that sort of is going to be able to address the needs of poorer countries as well. Now, the glorious, post-war settlement that we had the first few decades after the Second World War were, of course, not particularly concerned with climate change because that was not yet on our consciousness. But it was a period when, in fact, we were able to achieve simultaneously strong, stable democracies in at least the advanced nations, Europe and the United States, as well as many developing countries that were able to develop and grow very rapidly through export-oriented industrialization. So this framework of Keynesian social democracy combined with export-oriented industrialization was a key to that post-war settlement. And I want to say something about the importance of manufacturing and industrialization in this process, both to understand why it was so important in the past, and why I think it's not going to play as important a role in the years ahead. But before I come to that, I just want to state that, of course, this is past, and it's past partly because of the rise of the climate challenge, but also because of the inadequacies of the current technological trajectory of manufacturing, which has removed some of the key features in how it made that post-war settlement feasible. In particular, when we think about what was special about manufacturing historically and how it promoted simultaneously democracy and development, on the side of development, manufacturing was a extremely significant engine for economic growth because it was a sector that exhibited technological dynamism, lots of innovation and increase in productivity. Is a sector that is tradable, and therefore countries like Korea or Taiwan, later China, could focus on a few export industries, and those would carry the rest of the economy alongside, and they were not constrained on the demand side because the domestic markets were small, but the world market is large. So there were no constraints on the supply side, on the demand side. And very importantly, manufacturing historically has been a sector that has absorbed significant amount of low-skilled, low-educated workers. And that was critical because most countries that are growing or even advanced countries, they have large reservoirs of less than college-educated workers. And the question is whether you can actually draw them into productive sectors, in this case manufacturing. And it was easy to do that under the traditional model of industrialization because these workers didn't have to have high degrees of skill. Manufacturing wasn't particularly technologically advanced or capital intensive, really under sort of the, after the 1970s, with automation coming in, the fundamental change in the nature of manufacturing, that meant that manufacturing stopped being a labor-absorbing sector at some point, both because of technological changes, but also, of course, the nature of the change in global competition and rise of new exporters and so forth. So the main change there, sort of what I think for developing countries in particularly, has made manufacturing less of an engine of growth today as it used to be in the heyday of export-oriented industrialization, is that it no longer has the capacity to absorb the resource that low-income countries have the most plentiful of, which is low-educated, low-cost labor. So manufacturing, even in, and I'll show you some numbers on this in a second, even in successful exporters of manufacturing, is more or less becoming a kind of an enclave sector, the way that we think like in minerals, because it's sort of relatively capital-intensive, technology-intensive, but doesn't really absorb a lot of workers. Now, the second point here about manufacturing as a foundation for democracy is also important, and also went alongside with the labor-absorbing capacity of manufacturing historically, because as labor from the countryside flocked into industry, that was also, of course, the foundations of a middle class. There was a pathway to good jobs. This labor effectively subsequently became the force for pushing for democracy and social democracy, and that's how countries like South Korea eventually became democratic, starting from authoritarian regimes. So manufacturing-based, export-oriented industrialization brought not only growth, but also created a middle class that subsequently demanded rights, political parties that represented their interests, and ultimately democracy. Now, it's important to understand where we're coming from, and this is actually the secret sauce, the recipe that was so important to our post-war success, and how, in fact, this is now dissipated today. The industrialization, I think, has become a global phenomenon. This chart here shows this is the United States. Well, I'm not sure if you can read. Start on the left is Germany, United States, and Argentina. The one on the right has some number of other Latin American countries. Is that if you look at middle-income countries and advanced countries, regardless of where you are looking at, it's almost a complete regularity that employment in manufacturing is shrinking as part of the labor force today everywhere. So in that sense, Argentina is not an outlier at all. The trends are very similar everywhere. And this is not just also a advanced country or Latin American phenomenon either. What's interesting is that China and Asia, which are the regions that we think of as being sort of the manufacturing superpowers, the countries that are really sort of are eating our lunch, right? If you're a steel producer, they in fact are experiencing a very similar process of employment deindustrialization as well. And I want to draw your attention in what is perhaps the most striking number or chart that I'm going to show you today is in what has been happening to employment, manufacturing employment in China, which is that since about 15 years ago, Chinese manufacturing has lost about 30 million workers. 30 million jobs in manufacturing have disappeared from China. That's more than the total number of manufacturing jobs that exist in US and Germany taken together, okay? Now, why are we surprised that, in fact, jobs in manufacturing are disappearing in China? Well, because we think of China as having been, so successful in conquering world markets, and we heard some numbers in the previous session. And so what is happening is the paradox, of course, is all that employment deindustrialization is happening while, in fact, output and exports in China have been growing by leaps and bounds. So what is really happening is there's a kind of an output-employment disconnect in manufacturing today that simply did not exist before, which means that, on the one hand, that's great. Manufacturing is becoming, labor productivity is increasing, is growing through the roof in manufacturing. But on the other hand, from the perspective of the ability of manufacturing to foster the middle class, create good jobs, and be the foundation for a democracy, its ability, the manner in which it's unable to play that job, to play that role anymore because of the disappearing jobs in manufacturing. And this output-employment disconnect is essentially there in virtually all successful manufacturing exporters. So look at South Korea, the one that I've just circled here. Manufacturing value added and output keeps on increasing. Manufacturing employment has completely collapsed. So that's today's striking feature. So what does that mean in terms of the importance of manufacturing? I think it's going to mean that if you're concerned about innovation, certainly in advanced manufacturing, semiconductors, other areas, manufacturing is going to be very important from the standpoint of generating innovation. As I'll come to in a second, manufacturing is also going to be very important for the green transition, because for electric vehicles, batteries, green steel, and all the other stuff of the greening of manufacturing that you need to do in industry, manufacturing is still going to remain very significant. And for a lot of countries, manufacturing may be very important for national security reasons, because you want to ensure the safety, security of your supply chains, ensure resilience, and so forth. So there's a lot of reasons for which manufacturing is going to remain very important in the future. But from the perspective of this, one of those three, in fact, two of those three corners of that triangle, how do we build middle-class societies? How do we create good jobs? And how do we ensure inclusive economic growth and poverty reduction in low and middle income countries? Manufacturing is much less an answer there. Okay, that's the reality. It's not, I love manufacturing as much as anyone else. I did a lot of my research, my academic scholarship was on demonstrating that manufacturing was this special thing. But the more I look at the data, the more I look at sort of what's happening, it's become very clear that if we're not aware that manufacturing is unable to perform these important tasks that it did before of creating a sustaining middle class and being an engine of broad-based growth, that we will be blind to the alternative paths that we need to work on. And that's a lot of what I'm going to say in the rest of my talk. So if it's not manufacturing, where will the jobs be? Obviously, it's not going to be agriculture, because agriculture will not reabsorb the labor that is released. It's going to be services, and essentially services everywhere. And what kind of services? So when we talk about services, it's not going to be all the coding and the college professors and finance and lawyers and business consultants. All of that will be taken up by AI, right? Those are the ones who will lose their jobs. It's these ones that, which are the ones that we don't necessarily think of jobs that are sexy or interesting or that industrial policy should be or economic policy should be concerned about, but necessarily these are the jobs of the future. And if we want to build inclusive societies with broad-based middle classes, we will have to figure out how to create good jobs out of these, which will mean making these a lot more productive. So what are these? Well, these are some numbers from the United States for projections of where the jobs of the future are. The 10 largest occupations, almost like a decade from now. This is taking into account all the expected trends in demand and technological change and so forth. Home, health, and personal care aid. This is a big issue, of course, in all countries where there's aging, and That's going to be as much true in Argentina as it is in the United States. Personal health care, long-term care, this is going to be the largest source of employment in the United States. Those are some of the worst jobs in the labor market. Okay? Fast food and counter workers, food preparation workers, general operation managers. Maybe that's the one that actually requires a university degree. But essentially none of these others do, like retail salespersons, laborers and freight stock and material movers, people who work in the warehouses, right? Stockers and order fillers, cashiers, customer service representatives, janitors and cleaners and so forth. These, confronting this reality of where the jobs of the future are also makes clear that some of our knee-jerk responses to how do we create good jobs are going to work. Investing in education is not the answer, right? Because none of these 8 out of those 10 top categories actually do not require a college degree, right? But from the standpoint of AI and new technology, there's an upside because many of these jobs are actually going to be very difficult to actually replace through AI because they are, we're talking about this in break. None of us would want our parents or grandparents not to be cared for by AI, right? I mean, we want basically the human touch, the personal touch, but AI actually provides the possibilities that these people, whether it's food service workers, warehouse workers or long-term care workers, that if they have access to customized AI that's built for that purpose, that they can be significantly more productive, provide services that are much more sophisticated than they currently do, providing a much better service and then making their patients or the customers much more satisfied and reducing costs overall in the system, because if you can reduce incidence of chronic illnesses instead of hospital admission, you're going to reduce the whole cost of the healthcare system. So there is the genuine productivity gains from using AI, new technologies in these sectors in the right kind of a way. But it's going to need focusing on exactly how we can develop technologies of that kind, thinking about an industrial policy that is focusing on these services rather than traditional industrial policies. Okay? So, coming back to these triple challenges, so what does the new context actually imply? So, they're all imply the need to foster certain kinds of structural change in the economy, but the nature of this structural change is going to be necessarily different than in the past. Of course, first is a transition to new renewables and green technologies, being able to foster that. With respect to rebuilding the middle class, I think the most important challenge and priority is being able to figure out how we build good jobs in these kinds of services that I've just talked to you about. And then from a development perspective, there's the developing country or low-income version of this, is how do we develop more productive sectors within largely these kinds of services. Now, the reason that all of these require specific policies is that the markets on their own are not very good at delivering the kind of structural change, because markets are not generally very good about sort of internalizing the longer-term benefits of some of these structural changes. There are externalities, there are coordination failures, there are sort of short-sightedness in financial markets and so forth. So I think for that reason, we'll need what used to be called industrial policy, but what I hope will make clear is a very different kind of a renovated kind of industrial policy that's sort of focusing on fostering these structural changes. Now, we've had now 2 recent administrations in the United States in their own way trying to deal with some of these issues. I think Bidenomics, under President Biden, we had a version of these industrial policies already in place. So the CHIPS Act and the IRA in particular in the way that it targeted climate change and the green technologies. It was the American version of Chinese green industrial policies, about which I'm going to talk about in a second to exemplify the practice of industrial policy and how it can be very powerful. But I think where Bidenomics fell short is that it shared with the right a kind of an obsession with manufacturing, which is that, of course, it was their policy of rebuilding the middle class was to reshore manufacturing. But you look at, in many ways, the Biden policies were a success, but you look at manufacturing share of employment, it continued to fall under Biden. It never recovered. By the way, it's still falling under Trump, too. So that seems to be something you really can't do much about. And if you're concerned about rebuilding the middle class, I do think, as I've tried to suggest, that you need to go focus much more on services. Now, Trump. It won't be a surprise that I have a very different view of Trumponomics than Robert Lighthizer. I think the main instrument here has been tariffs. And obviously, climate change, I think, is not even an objective, right? We don't really believe in that, and Trump administration doesn't really care about poverty reduction, so those are not even priorities under the Trump agenda. The middle class remains kind of a stated objective. But when you look at what the main instrument is, it's, by the end of my talk, I'll get this controller to do what I wanted to do. I missed something, no? Okay, why tariffs? So I think the problem with tariffs, and again, I used to be the radical on this. I would come to audiences like this and say, look, tariffs are not that bad. But the problem using tariffs as your main and only instrument is that it's very, very blunt in terms of achieving the objective. One big problem, as I've just said, is that, of course, tariffs deal with manufacturing at best. And what I've said is that there's no way that you're going to address your good jobs problem through trying to revive manufacturing. But even within manufacturing, even if you're focusing on reshoring and rebuilding your manufacturing base, the relationship between putting up tariffs over here and increasing your manufacturing productivity, innovation, capacity, and so forth is very, very indirect. And of course, Latin America learned this after long history of import substitution, industrialization, which often did not work. Because what do tariffs do? Tariffs make some segments, some firms become more profitable, right? If they don't have, they're not bringing many inputs, and they simply are protected behind tariff walls, so their profits go up. Good, but what's the link? Is that necessarily going to make business people say, I better innovate more? I better invest more. I better invest in the skills of my workforce. So all the good things you want to do to reinvigorate manufacturing, it's not clear that simply by making certain firms more profitable you're going to do it, because firm might decide, we're going to return the profits to our shareholders, or we're going to pay a return to our managers instead of doing all of these things. Instead, the way that you go about, if you really want to achieve those objectives, is actually engage directly in the practice of industrial policy, which is that you work directly with firms to understand what their problems are and how you can remove those obstacles. So you deal with direct constraints and direct obstacles and opportunities. And that's what was different really with Biden's industrial policy. It wasn't tariffs. It was, okay, I want semiconductor in Arizona. I want TSMC to come into Arizona and build big advanced chip manufacturing. What is it that they need in order to invest here? They need the infrastructure. They need workforce training. They need the appropriate greenfield. And let me work with local authorities to make sure that all of these things are. Yes, of course, I'll also give them subsidies, but it's not just subsidies, because if subsidies or tariffs were the main way you got these things, that the geography of global production today would look very different and would be mostly where things are subsidized, they do have production. I think tariffs, again, I want to say, I'm not anti-tariff per se, but tariffs, when they work as a complement to other policies, as a kind of a shield to protect an existing domestic strategy of trying to help your firms and build them and become more competitive. On their own, they don't necessarily do very much, okay? I would also say, and I think this is an important point, that the problem with tariffs is not that they're instance of economic nationalism. I don't think economic nationalism is a terrible thing. I think the best thing that a country can do is actually do the best for its own economy. And if you have a healthy economy, growing economy, and a cohesive society, even if you're pursuing heterodox policies, okay, ultimately you're providing the best gift you can provide to the rest of the world. Okay? So the problem with tariffs, I think, is that they do not actually serve the US national economic interests, in my view. So it's not, I wish the Trump administration was genuinely economic nationalist in the sense that they were pursuing policies that were in the genuine national interest of the United States. And I think those policies would actually be less damaging to the rest of the world. I have 10 minutes or so, and I'll go into some of these things, especially with regard to services, a little bit more. But let me just sort of do a recap and highlight what I think are two critical questions. So what I've said is that we need specific industrial policies that are these reinvigorated industrial policies in these three distinct domains. And we still need to think through a little bit about what does that mean, what kind of industrial policy really. And then I want to come back to the question of economic nationalism and sort of what is it, if everybody pursues these policies unilaterally, what would the world economy actually look like? So there I'm really going to say that I think the problem with Chinese industrial policies was not so much that China did it. I think it was much more that other countries did not emulate it adequately, right? Because I think those policies are not necessarily contradictory. Okay, so I want to go directly into the one area where I think demonstrates how powerful industrial policy can be, how, in fact, China has used these policies, how, in fact, this has, on the whole, been a huge source of positive spillovers for the world economy. So rather than being a kind of a zero-sum thing, right? Because what has China done? China has gone whole hog into promoting renewables and subsequently electric vehicles and batteries and so forth. That's exactly what the climate doctor ordered for the world economy. Right? Because that's a critical challenge, and anything that brings the cost of renewables down and makes renewables cost competitive with fossil fuels is a huge boon for the climate. It's a huge boon for the world economy. In fact, Chinese industrial policies, China's green industrial policies, I would argue, is the best thing that has happened in our fight against climate change. Has achieved much more than any of the global environmental summits or COPs and has actually achieved. Because effectively bringing down the cost of renewables and making them cost competitive, now we see it all over the world, how in fact production is moving using solar and wind and other renewable technology in the green direction. And that's not exclusively, but largely due to China's industrial policies. So what was critical about these policies? What were some of the features? One is it was very much a kind of a deliberate effort. It was a national project. It was a articulation of a new developmental model. And it was not a single policy. It was not, we often talk about China's subsidies, and it's true that they are there, but that doesn't do justice to the variety of policies that China actually used. It was credit, it was public investment in infrastructure R&D, it was government procurement, a lot of local policies, a lot of public venture capital that invested in these, and a very explicitly experimental approach setting up demonstration zones, figuring out what works or not, and then essentially iterating and revising policies and putting these feedback loops into action. Okay? So starting with the notion that you know that not everything is going to work out. That's very important in industrial policy because, as the saying goes, you cannot pick winners. Governments cannot pick winners. And that's not the criterion for effective industrial policy. The criterion really is, can you let the losers go? So for that, you need to figure out where the losers are. You need monitoring. You need iteration. And in that, generally, China has been much better. Okay? We have a kind of a contrasting example in the United States, which poisoned for about 10 years the environment, the political climate for the pursuit of green industrial policies in the United States. And that's the infamous example of Solyndra. I don't know how many people remember Solyndra. Before China actually went full-fledged into green industrial policies, in 2009, the Obama administration was one of the first governments to actually try to implement green industrial policies and move into renewables. And they set up funds under the Department of Energy to provide loans and loan guarantees to startups. And that was going to be sort of, it was an early version of Chinese-type industrial policies in the United States. Now, but this was managed in a very different way. Rather than treating this as a kind of experimental program where necessarily there'll be some failures and some successes, the Obama administration ended up picking one of the initial recipients of these loans, Solyndra, and planting a political flag on it and saying, this is our future. One particular firm with an untested technology. Well, this untested technology eventually failed, and it made the whole program look like it was a complete failure. Very few people noticed at the time that another firm that actually received almost similar amounts of money from the government at the time was Tesla. Tesla put the money into very good use. It became the firm that it is today and actually turned around. Any rational social cost-benefit analysis of whether these loans were good or not would have to do a portfolio analysis of all these loans and whether, in fact, the benefits that Tesla provided were more than, in fact, there were probably many, many more times the costs that were generated because of the failures like Solyndra. So, but because of the manner in which this was politically managed, of actually just highlighting one company, then it looked like this had been a total failure. So I think there are important lessons here in terms of how to manage these programs. And I think the dividing line between success and failure in these industrial policies is less about democratic countries versus authoritarian countries. So don't think about this as US versus China. Think about sort of the much more finer detail about how these programs are managed. So it wasn't necessarily in China, certainly that wasn't because it was a very top-down planning. If you think about China as centrally planned communist country, and that's how they got this sector going, that would be a wild mischaracterization of actually how the system worked and how they used competition and how they used experimentation and decentralization and the power of local municipalities competing with each other in a loosely market-based way. To achieve those ends. So my answer is generally yes, that this is something that democracies can do as well. And this is also, I don't have time to talk about sort of what the actual empirical academic research on industrial policy shows, but let me just summarize it by saying that compared to 10, 15 years ago, when if you were to ask sort of what do economists know about industrial policy, the general conclusion would do tends not to work. I think that view has been now completely, not completely, but to a large extent has been altered by a new wave of evidence that's much more careful about ascertaining causal inference and so forth. And in general, the answer is that there is a much more positive view of industrial policy. But it's important to highlight, and I come back to the point that I made before, that when we think about industrial policies, that we're really thinking about ways of doing that's going to be very different from our traditional way of thinking about industrial policy. Because for one thing, the ends are somewhat different, right? Because even the term industrial policy is now a misnomer to the extent that you're directing it towards services rather than manufacturing. The changes are, again, let me, interest of time, just skip some of my slides. But first, as I was saying at the outset, that we need to, insofar as good jobs and the middle class is concerned, I think we need to put much more emphasis on services. Second, we need to go back to that sort of insight from Biden's industrial policies, also China's green industrial policies, is that you don't want to think about industrial policy not just only as tariffs, but not only as subsidies either. Because I think it's the industrial policy that sort of is effectively government agencies working with potential investors, innovators, and understanding what their needs are and providing the specific public inputs or the public services, whether it's technological assistance or marketing assistance or workforce training for particular types of skills or regulatory assistance or assistance with greenfields. These provision of specific inputs that are customized to different firms or clusters of firms, typically much more effective than subsidies per se. This is extremely important. I think that when we think about, since the focus of industrial policy is to create new productive areas, whether it's renewables and green industry or it is good jobs, productivity is key in generating greater productive clusters. And there, we need to ensure that the kind of technology and innovation that takes place is also focusing on these tasks. So I think it was a big mistake that, well, not big mistake, but one thing we've learned from the process of automation in manufacturing was that it ended up being largely labor displacing. Robots replaced workers. With the new wave of digital and technologies and AI, it doesn't have to be that way. These new technologies can actually complement and augment the skills that less than college educated and low skilled workers can do. And I gave you the example of care workers earlier, but this is a broader point. But it's going to require focus on this, because I think if you let this only to the AI innovators, I think they have a very different view of how AI should move. So I think that the notion of directed technological change and involving the government in this area, I think, is going to be important. I'm running out of time, and so let me just come, I think, to maybe my last point, and that's sort of returning back to economic nationalism, and make the point that we are all, I think, worried, and we're right to be worried that we're moving, no matter what happens in the United States, that we're moving into a world economy where global cooperation is going to be in short supply, right? It makes, we can wish it were otherwise, but we just have to be, cognizant of the fact that there will be less global cooperation, okay? I'd like to leave you with the idea that that's, in a lot of areas that worry about this, that's not necessarily a bad thing. That countries doing their own thing can actually be a good thing for the rest of the world too. There are some areas where this is certainly not the case, but I think one big area where we've seen it's the other way around was actually how China's green industrial policies and technological innovation in solar, wind, electric vehicles, and batteries actually ended up producing huge spillovers for the rest of the world and making the green transition much more cost-effective. So I think, despite the possible exceptions of the occasional incidents of beggar thy neighbor policies, that often is the problem is not that countries are pursuing economic nationalism. The problem is that they're not sufficiently economic nationalists, that they're pursuing policies that are not good for themselves. And I think, as I said earlier, that's the main problem with with Trump's economic policies. So I think, we can envisage a world, and that's sort of my final layer of optimism that I'm going to leave you with a world where, in fact, there is a lot less global cooperation, globalization, global institutions, global rules are a lot thinner than we used to aspire to. But as long as we have, certain crude rules of the road, and as long as we understand that a lot of world trade investment can be positive sum rather than zero sum, that there is the possibility of even a thinner globalization to be one that pursues and attains those three objectives that I started out with. And in fact, might even be better in achieving those objectives than our much more ambitious goals under the hyperglobalization era. But I'm an optimist.
Muchas gracias, Dr. Rodrik. La siguiente exposición sobre el tema competitividad desde adentro, la agenda de comercio que no depende del mundo, estará a cargo de Juan Carlos Hallak, doctor en Economía por la Universidad de Harvard. Además es profesor titular y director de la Maestría en Economía de la Universidad de Buenos Aires e investigador del CONICET. Su trabajo académico se centra en un comercio internacional y desarrollo productivo, con publicaciones en revistas especializadas. Fue profesor en la Universidad de San Andrés, Universidad de Michigan, profesor visitante en la Universidad de Columbia y miembro del National Bureau of Economic Research. En la gestión pública se desempeñó como subsecretario de Inserción Internacional en el año 2019 y presidente de la Comisión Nacional de Comercio Exterior entre 2017 y 2018. Doctor Hallak, ahora sí, lo escuchamos.
Buenas tardes, muchísimas gracias por estar acá. Sé que vinieron a verme a mí. Un placer, gracias a la organización Techint por invitarme. Un placer ser parte de participar del Boletín Techint, que hace tantos años viene contribuyendo al debate sobre política industrial, política productiva. El título de mi presentación va a ser Competitividad desde adentro, la agenda de comercio que no depende del mundo. Dani, maybe you have the... Ah. Bueno, quizás para motivar esta presentación, el mundo está mostrando fuertes procesos de cambio, es lo que estamos discutiendo acá bastante. Un drástico cambio en la forma de conducir la política comercial y la política industrial. Pero nosotros también estamos transitando drásticos cambios por otras razones. Venimos haciendo cambios importantes en nuestra economía. Entonces surge la pregunta de cómo conducir la política comercial e industrial compatibilizando nuestras necesidades de cambio con lo que está pasando en el mundo. Entonces ese un poco va a ser el sentido de esta presentación. Voy a primero hablar de un poco caracterizar lo que creo que es dónde estamos parados hoy, la Argentina de hoy, nuestro punto de partida. Un poco hablar del mundo que cambia, no mucho porque ya se ha hablado de esto, solo lo que nos interesa para poder ir al tercer punto, que es entonces el punto de la presentación, que es cómo hacer política comercial e industrial en Argentina en el contexto de un mundo convulsionado e incierto. Empezamos por el primer punto, le voy a dedicar bastante porque creo que es importante esto, pensar bien a dónde estamos parados para poder entender cómo reaccionar ante un mundo que está cambiando tanto. Y para ver bien a dónde estamos hoy, es importante primero tener en claro de dónde venimos. Una economía caracterizada por dos rasgos centrales, muchos más, pero estos son los dos principales en los que quiero concentrarme en los últimos años. Primero, fuertísimos vaivenes en la política comercial, con recurrentes periodos de lo que voy a llamar protección extraordinaria, ya les voy a decir en qué consiste o a qué le estoy llamando esto, y obviamente la fuerte inestabilidad macroeconómica. Esta protección extraordinaria, ¿qué es? bueno, un poco aranceles relativamente altos con respecto al resto del mundo. Estos son aranceles nación más favorecida promedio en manufacturas, excluyendo maquinarias. También somos fuertes usuarios de medidas antidumping, uno de los principales en el mundo. Pero tal vez el aspecto más importante de lo que yo llamaría, no tal vez, seguramente el aspecto más importante de lo que, cómo podríamos caracterizar a esta política comercial como protección extraordinaria, es el fuerte uso y abuso de las licencias no automáticas de importación. Acá es una medida permitida, regulada por la OMC, pero abusada por Argentina en varios periodos. Acá ven año por año la cantidad de posiciones arancelarias a 8 dígitos, en total son aproximadamente 10.000, con licencias no automáticas. Y ven cómo hubo un crecimiento en el tiempo, y particularmente hubo con 2 periodos entre 2012 y 2015 con las de High, y muy recientemente, fin de 2022 a fin de 2023, con las CIRAS, donde cada despacho de importación requería una autorización. Esto es algo inaudito en el mundo, aún los países proteccionistas no tienen esto. Una cosa muy singular en el mundo, el uso de esta herramienta de forma tan generalizada. Con las consecuencias, primero tiene distintas magnitudes, distintas dimensiones esta protección comercial extraordinaria. La magnitud, esto que les decía, no llegar a que cada embarque necesite un permiso especial. No es algo común, ningún país lo hace. En la forma en que lo llegó a hacer Argentina. La discrecionalidad, sin reglas claras sobre quiénes o qué productos accedían a estas licencias de importación. Y la imprevisibilidad, criterios de aprobación cambiantes en el tiempo. Entonces eso es lo que caracteriza esta cosa particular de Argentina, de en recurrentes periodos tener una forma de protección y una magnitud de protección que no tiene nadie. Ni siquiera nuestros vecinos, nuestros socios del Mercosur, ni tampoco otros países de la región. La macroeconomía, no tengo que decirles mucho, la macroeconomía inestable, lo resumo en estos 3 gráficos: PBI volátil, tipo de cambio real multilateral volátil también, una inflación también volátil pero con tendencia creciente, con consecuencias de respuesta macroeconómica en la forma de control de cambios, el llamado cepo, que también incluye restricciones a la importación de insumos e implicancias de apreciación cambiaria, y limitado acceso al crédito, que es imprescindible para la exportación. ¿Y a dónde quiero llegar con esto? A que la combinación de estos recurrentes periodos de protección comercial extraordinaria y la macroeconomía inestable llevó a un entorno de políticas con un fuerte sesgo antiexportador. Con implicancias, por un lado, tuvo muchas implicancias, pero quiero destacar algunas que considero centrales: el limitado acceso a insumos importados, imprescindibles para exportar, escasa gimnasia competitiva en el mercado interno y apreciación cambiaria. Y todo eso ha llevado, en el correr de los años, a un sistema productivo con una fuerte orientación mercado-internista. Una orientación mercado-internista que solíamos tener todos los países en la era de sustitución de importaciones, pero que otros países dejaron atrás hace mucho, pero nosotros seguimos teniendo. Y estas condiciones, ¿por qué las destaco? Porque afectan principalmente, ¿cómo vuelvo para atrás? A ver si con esto. Afectan principalmente, quizás no tanto los commodities, que quizás no necesitan tanto de estos insumos importados y imprescindibles para exportar, o si los necesitan los consiguen, o la escasa gimnasia competitiva en el mercado interno, sino la producción de bienes diferenciados. Y después les voy a hablar un poco más de eso y les voy a decir por qué hago hincapié en ese tipo de bienes. Si vemos las consecuencias en términos de la estructura de exportaciones, vemos que solo 22% en 2024 fueron exportaciones de productos diferenciados, el resto productos no diferenciados. Que si los descomponemos a la derecha, la mayoría provienen del agro. Hay algunos también un poco, y con el tiempo va a ser creciente, el peso de los commodities en la energía, los combustibles de vaca muerta y la minería. En el tiempo, si vemos la evolución de las exportaciones en el tiempo, con la línea, esta foto que les mostré también se ve en la película. La línea azul son las exportaciones, que los vaivenes son principalmente por cambios en los precios internacionales de los commodities que exportamos. Pero la línea verde es la que muestra la exportación de bienes diferenciados. Y vemos que está estancada hace 15 años, igual que las exportaciones, en alrededor de 20.000 millones de dólares. Si tomamos bienes industriales, da parecido, porque casi 3/4 partes de los bienes diferenciados son bienes industriales. También hay bienes diferenciados que no son industriales, con base agrícola, no sé, el dulce de leche, algunos quesos que se pueden exportar y que exportamos, aceite de oliva fraccionado. Y también hay bienes industriales que son commodities, no sé, por ejemplo, el etileno o el aluminio en bruto. Si queremos ser un país con un ingreso per cápita y un salario en dólares más alto, necesitamos exportar más. No podemos, tenemos que mejorar, las exportaciones per cápita tienen que subir fuertemente. No hay otra manera. Por eso el foco que hago en la inserción internacional. El resultado de esta orientación mercado-internista se refleja también en el poco comercio internacional. Acá ustedes tienen, los puntitos son países, en el eje horizontal el PBI per cápita, y cuánto el eje vertical es lo que se llama el coeficiente de apertura, exportaciones más importaciones sobre PBI, y vemos que Argentina comercia muy poco con respecto a lo que uno esperaría de acuerdo a su ingreso per cápita. Aún si controlan por determinantes del comercio que tienen que ver con la ubicación geográfica lejana de Argentina o factores culturales, sigue pasando lo que se llama la ecuación de gravedad, sigue pasando también que Argentina comercia poco. Entonces este es un poco el panorama de dónde venimos. Las cosas cambiaron mucho hace un año o un año y medio con la asunción del nuevo gobierno. No voy a hablar de la macro, de estabilización. Sí hubo avances en ese sentido, pero quizás lo que quiero destacar son los fuertes cambios en la política comercial. Principalmente el más destacable es que desde el día 1 se eliminaron las licencias no automáticas de importación. Las importaciones ya no requieren autorización previa. Cualquiera que quiera importar, importa, salvo casos especiales, pero en términos generalizados, ese componente, el más disruptivo, el componente central de esta protección extraordinaria, ya no está más. También se redujeron aranceles específicos, a pesar de que nosotros tenemos los aranceles limitados por el nomenclador del Mercosur, tenemos excepciones, entonces se han usado esas excepciones que estaban al alza se han llevado a los niveles normales, como fertilizantes y agroquímicos, neumáticos, electrodomésticos. Algunos productos que estaban con el nomenclador al revés se bajaron, como insumos plásticos, teléfonos celulares, bienes de capital, y también se bajaron aranceles en el sector de textil, indumentaria y calzado. Se ha limitado mucho el uso del antidumping, no solo se aplica mayor rigor en el análisis de cada medida, sino que se ha cambiado la normativa general, ahora la vigencia máxima es de 3 años, con una única prórroga de 2 años. Se le ha dado intervención a defensa del consumidor y defensa de la competencia. También ha habido una flexibilización en los reglamentos técnicos, principalmente a lo que hace a la evaluación de la conformidad. Principalmente ahora hay para los bienes industriales un reconocimiento de ensayos técnicos y certificaciones hechas en el exterior. También se han removido algunos reglamentos técnicos. Entonces, ¿a dónde quedamos parados ahora? ¿A dónde estamos parados en términos de protección comercial? Los aranceles son relativamente altos, pero se removió el componente extraordinario de la protección. Ya no es singular nuestra protección con respecto a la del mundo. Es un poco alta, pero no es particularmente o extraordinariamente alta. Destacablemente el acceso a los insumos importados hoy es previsible y se removieron las principales trabas disruptivas al comercio. Hubo más medidas, pero me quiero concentrar en esto nada más. También está habiendo un incipiente retorno al crédito, quizás no en estos últimos días, pero pensando en los últimos meses. Entonces, donde quiero llegar es ese sesgo antiexportador en la política, hoy no está. eso ya no está. El desafío que tenemos ahora es, a pesar de no tener un sesgo exportador en la política, la competitividad de nuestra industria sigue siendo débil en términos generales. Quiero pensar un poquito en este punto de cuál es la Argentina que pensamos a futuro, cómo sería esa Argentina donde queremos ir. Y existe un fuerte consenso que se ha creado en los últimos tiempos de que la explotación de nuestros recursos naturales nos puede llevar al desarrollo. Y se pone como referencia a países como Australia, como Noruega, que son desarrollados y que han basado o la explotación de los recursos claramente acompañó ese desarrollo. Pero bueno, el punto acá que quiero hacer muy fuerte, que venimos haciendo hace un tiempo con Andrés López, que trabajo muchos de estos temas con él, es que no tenemos suficientes recursos naturales. Si ven acá este gráfico son exportaciones de recursos naturales per cápita, y ven que Noruega, a la derecha, la segunda barrita, tiene casi $30.000 per cápita de exportaciones de minería, de petróleo principalmente, Australia 13.000. Nosotros tenemos $1.000 per cápita de exportaciones de recursos naturales o bienes fuertemente basados en recursos naturales. Si tomamos proyecciones, o sea, estamos bien lejos, si tomamos proyecciones a 2030, y podría llegar a casi 2.000, todavía muy lejos de esos países. Si se duplicara después, 5 años después, se volviera a duplicar esto, estaríamos en el nivel de Chile. Claramente estaríamos mejor. Pero tenemos el nivel de Chile, un país que se plantea, que está mejor, pero se plantea cómo diversificar su estructura productiva para poder convertirse en un país desarrollado. Entonces, el punto que quiero transmitir es, con la riqueza natural es alta, pero no tanto, no nos alcanza para el desarrollo. Tenemos que desarrollar la estructura productiva más allá de los recursos naturales. Por otro lado, tenemos la tecnología se ha codificado en gran medida, se ha posibilitado las tecnologías de información, se controla más la producción a distancia. Por distintos motivos, hay países con salarios mucho más bajos que logran producir eficientemente y competir en el mercado mundial de manufacturas, y no podemos competir con esos países. Al menos no en aquellos productos que compiten principalmente por precio. Y entonces la pregunta es, bueno, ¿cómo nos insertamos en el mundo? ¿Qué es lo que vamos a exportar? ¿Cómo vamos a subir las exportaciones? Y un poco lo que les quiero transmitir, yo también soy optimista como Dani, y quiero transmitirles que tenemos oportunidades en muchos sectores productivos, en una infinidad de sectores productivos, y esas oportunidades están ligadas a productos que pueden diferenciarse, que tienen suficiente grado de diferenciación. Y esa posibilidad de diferenciación se puede dar por el diseño, por la funcionalidad, por la tecnología, por el packaging, por el advertising, de 1000 maneras, siempre anclados en una calidad que en general se requiere que sea mayor a la que prevalece en el mercado interno. Y ahí en general fallamos, nuestro sistema productivo falla en eso. No todos, no, acá en esta casa no les voy a decir, muchas empresas grandes no tienen ese problema, pero sí es un problema común del entramado productivo. Pequeñas y medianas empresas tienen ese problema. Pero quizás el mensaje optimista es, hay muchos que sí, es limitada la cantidad, tendrían que ser muchos más, pero hay muchas empresas en muchísimos sectores, desde Argentina, que exportan bienes diferenciados. De distinto tipo, desde los tubos sin costura, desde mesas, desde productos alimenticios diferenciados, productos biotecnológicos, de todo tipo tenemos productos que exportamos y que podemos exportar. Podemos hacer eso en cantidades mucho mayores. Pero hay una Argentina productiva hoy que hace eso, y no es solo la industria, esto refiere también al agro y refiere también a los servicios. Esta posibilidad de exportar este tipo de bienes, aún con salarios más altos que el de muchos países. Y creo que el desafío y la oportunidad está ahí, en ese tipo de bienes. Entonces quiero parar acá, tener esto en la cabeza un poco. ¿Dónde es que hay que apuntar? Quiero parar acá un poco para decir, bueno, de dónde, un poco tener claro de dónde venimos y a dónde pensamos que deberíamos ir, a dónde está la posibilidad si queremos ser un país desarrollado. Y en ese camino que venimos cambiando mucho las cosas, nos enfrentamos a un mundo que, como ya han escuchado, también está cambiando en un montón de cosas. Y entonces, bueno, no les voy a decir mucho de esto porque ya han dicho y la verdad que no tengo muchas cosas para decir. Quiero destacar algunas cositas básicas para tener en cuenta. El multilateralismo ya se venía debilitando desde antes de Trump. Parálisis del órgano de apelaciones de la OMC, como dijo Lighthizer acá cuando estaba, destacó esto. La dificultad para aprobar subsidios de China y aplicar derechos compensatorios bajo reglas de la OMC. Los aranceles al acero y al aluminio, apelando de una forma cuestionable a argumentos de seguridad nacional. La guerra tarifaria entre Estados Unidos y China. Multiplicidad de factores que ya venían debilitando el sistema, pero bueno, se rompe totalmente. Principalmente Trump rompe con los postulados básicos del multilateralismo. Hay una flagrante violación del principio de no discriminación, que es la columna vertebral del multilateralismo, esto de poner tarifas diferentes a cada país, no reconocimiento de acuerdos existentes. Y tiene implicancia, esto empieza a tener implicancia sobre otros países. En particular, nosotros en el Mercosur ya tenemos implicancias, por ejemplo, en contraposición al acuerdo en bloque con la Unión Europea, con Estados Unidos estamos negociando cada uno por su cuenta, a pesar de ser una unión aduanera. Y también hemos ampliado la lista de excepciones al arancel externo común justamente para poder negociar mejor con Estados Unidos. Entonces, ¿cómo termina todo esto? Difícil predecir, y yo no soy quizás la mejor persona para poder predecir, pero quizás cuestiones básicas a tener en cuenta. Obviamente, estamos en un escenario de comercio global sujeto a una fuerte incertidumbre. Es razonable pensar que los acuerdos bilaterales y regionales van a ganar preeminencia por sobre los avances multilaterales. Entonces, la pregunta es, en este mundo, ¿cómo nos paramos nosotros? Y esa va a ser la última parte de la presentación. Voy a empezar un poco por la política comercial para después hablar más generalmente de la política productiva. Me voy a concentrar en la agenda inmediata de la política comercial. Vuelvo a algo que ya habíamos hablado. Ya removimos este componente de protección extraordinaria, el componente más disruptivo. En mi opinión, se hizo demasiado rápido y además bajo condiciones de apreciación cambiaria. Pero bueno, creo que ya está hecho, no vamos a discutir acá, pero no desandaría ese camino. El comercio ahora opera bajo parámetros normales y en forma previsible. ¿Cómo debería continuar ahora la apertura comercial? Bueno, teniendo en cuenta esto que les dije antes, creo que no hay urgencia para continuar su profundización en el corto plazo. Creo que ya se ha abierto bastante por ahora, a pesar de que quisiéramos hacerlo más en el futuro. Es momento de que las cosas, dejar que se acomoden un poco a esta nueva realidad. Pero también menos aún en una situación donde los aranceles u otras medidas también de política comercial van a ser más un arma de negociación para garantizar acceso a otros mercados. Simplemente eso, no tengo mucho más para decir con respecto a esto. Pensemos un poquito también en este mundo. De nuevo, va a ser muy poquito lo que les pueda decir, pero quiero pensar cuestiones básicas, de cómo cosas básicas que uno pensaría de cómo pararnos en este mundo. Hay riesgos, yo pensaría, los dividiría en riesgos defensivos y ofensivos. Riesgos defensivos es riesgos a perder lo que ya tenemos. Riesgos ofensivos es riesgos a no poder conseguir lo que queremos conseguir. Entonces, los riesgos defensivos, yo creo que en principio son limitados. Nunca se puede saber, tómenlo con pinzas todos, pero si uno pensara, estamos menos expuestos a riesgos que otros países. Primero, exportamos mayormente commodities. Los commodities en gran medida están determinados, tienen un precio internacional que sirve de referencia para los precios que se transan, que todos transan teniendo como referencia ese precio, y está determinado en gran medida por oferta y demanda global. Entonces, difícil que restricciones bilaterales terminen afectando eso en gran medida. ¿A dónde quiero ir? Que nuestra producción de commodities no creo que tengamos problemas en el futuro de exportarla. No creo que es un riesgo fuerte en el futuro, al menos en el futuro próximo. El desafío para para los commodities es incrementar la producción. Y es el desafío que ya estamos atacando, buscando una macroeconomía estable, condiciones para la inversión, para explotar nuestros recursos naturales, que claramente nos van a ayudar. ¿Hay riesgos focalizados de acceso a mercado en bienes que ya exportamos? Sí, hay riesgos, y bueno, en esta casa lo saben más que nadie. El ejemplo son los tubos sin costura y aluminio de Estados Unidos. Tenemos una estructura de comercio con orígenes y destinos diversificados, y eso es algo relativamente bueno. No dependemos de un país, otros países están mucho más expuestos. Sí tenemos que tener atención particular a excedentes que puedan aparecer por estas condiciones mundiales y tomar medidas adecuadas para lidiar con ellos. Tratando de hacer el wrap-up de todo esto, ¿no? Riesgos defensivos son los que les dije, estas tres cosas. Riesgos ofensivos también son inciertos, pero diversificados también. De nuevo, es este universo de bienes, de oportunidades que tenemos en distintos bienes del agro, de la industria y de los servicios, distintos productos a distintos mercados. Es lo que hoy no exportamos y podríamos exportar. Bueno, esas oportunidades son diversificadas. Si se nos complica, tenemos problemas con algún país, podemos exportar a otros. Tenemos problemas con un producto, podemos exportar a otro. No quiero ser tan simple, pero hay una realidad que no es que nuestra oportunidad está en un bien. Estas oportunidades desaprovechadas a donde podemos ir y donde hoy no estamos, es bastante diversificado, tanto en términos de productos como en términos de destinos. Entonces, pensaría que estos riesgos ofensivos tampoco son tan grandes. En este marco, de acá con esto quiero cerrar esta pequeña ventana de análisis más general, llamémosle geopolítico si quieren. ¿Tiene sentido más una estrategia de alineamiento, de neutralidad? Yo pensaría más lo segundo. No tenemos obligación de tomar partido en este contexto. Lo importante, creo, es estar preparados para una agenda intensa de negociaciones bilaterales y regionales. Entonces, un poco hasta ahí es donde quiero llegar un poco describir de dónde venimos, a dónde estamos, cuáles son nuestros desafíos, y este mundo que cambia, que nos enfrentamos a este mundo que está cambiando, y cómo nos afecta a esto que queríamos hacer y no estamos pudiendo hacer. Y entonces creo que al final el desafío central está puertas adentro, y por eso el título de la presentación tiene que ver con esto. Entonces, ¿cuál es la agenda? Por un lado, una agenda de condiciones básicas. Detallo algunos elementos centrales: estabilidad de precios, profundización financiera, dos aspectos en los que se ha mejorado mucho en el último año, remoción de distorsiones impositivas, mejoras en la regulación laboral. Esta es la agenda que está en la discusión pública. No tengo mucho más para decir, es importantísima, pero no me quiero detener en esta agenda. Súper relevante, pero de nuevo que está siendo atacada, y si no está atacada, igual está en la discusión pública. Me quiero concentrar en una segunda agenda que creo que no solo no está atacada, sino en la cual estamos retrocediendo, que es una agenda de internacionalización productiva. Cómo promover la producción competitiva de bienes y servicios. Y el leitmotiv de lo que voy a decir, a donde quiero llegar, es que hace falta tener una política industrial, déjenme llamarlo productiva, atado a los desafíos de la internacionalización. Y hay dos cosas que quiero destacar acá. Primero, que lo que les voy a decir no aplica solo a la industria, aplica el desafío de exportar productos diferenciados, creo que aplica de la misma manera a exportar productos diferenciados provenientes del agro, provenientes de la industria o provenientes de los servicios. El desafío es el mismo, el desafío de políticas. Y el segundo, esta segunda parte, atado a los desafíos de internacionalización. Entonces voy a empezar por lo último, lo de atado a los desafíos de la internacionalización. El punto que quiero hacer es que la política productiva tiene que tener a la internacionalización como driver, ¿no? El driver, pensarlo como driver del desarrollo productivo. déjeme decirle, llamarlo brecha de calidad, como lo han llamado Chuck Sable y Piero Gessi, pero es un concepto más amplio, ¿no?, que limita las posibilidades de internacionalización. Hay distintos patrones de consumo entre nuestro país y otros países, muchos determinados por las diferencias de ingreso y el consumo más sofisticado en los países desarrollados, pero no solo eso, también por distintas idiosincrasias, también diferentes prácticas de negocios. Y bueno, acá un poco viene lo que es como mi parte personal, lo que he estudiado como investigador en los últimos 20 años, un poco los desafíos, ¿qué determina que las empresas exporten o no exporten, o que los sectores productivos exporten o no exporten? Siempre hablando del mundo de los bienes diferenciados. Y tiene mucho que ver con esto, con las empresas que sí logran exportar y siempre he encontrado el mismo patrón. Cambian la calidad, mejoran la calidad, pero no solo eso. Empecé pensando en eso, pero es mucho más que eso. Adaptan los productos, cambian la forma de comercializar, la forma de relacionarse con distribuidores. Hay un montón de cosas que hacen distintas a lo que hacen en el mercado interno. Las que no lo hacen, no es que no lo hacen porque no lo saben hacer o porque no lo pueden hacer. Tienen conciencia de que eso es lo que hay que hacer. Y entonces eso es la principal barrera, y creo que el origen de todo eso es la falta de entendimiento de los mercados externos. No saber lo que no se sabe. Hay una literatura en psicología muy conocida que habla de esto, ¿no?, de que uno cuando tiene desconocimiento, hay un campo del conocimiento en lo que uno está corto, a la vez no reconoce esa falta de conocimiento, ¿no? Por eso lo de unskilled and unaware of it. Y acá un poco eso, la manifestación de eso es la ausencia de una cultura de exportación en el entramado industrial. Y en general también, digamos, en el entramado productivo que hace a la producción de bienes diferenciados internacionalizables. Obviamente, no hay muchos que esto no aplica obviamente a muchas grandes empresas, pero sí a gran parte del entramado pyme. Y el punto que quiero destacar también es esto último, que dice que sin capacidad de internacionalización se reducen los incentivos a innovar e invertir. Como el desarrollismo tradicionalmente acá, ¿qué pensó? Que, bueno, hagamos la política productiva, que es dar incentivos a invertir, a innovar, quizás cerrar el mercado para que crezcan las empresas, pensando que así se hacen fuertes y mañana exportan. Quizás eso valió en el pasado, pero hoy eso es un callejón sin salida. Las empresas, si no resuelven estos problemas específicos que hacen a la internacionalización y en general no los resuelven, eso les reduce fuertemente los incentivos a innovar e invertir. Y la causalidad entonces es al revés. Si no resolvemos estos problemas de internacionalización, solo cuando los resuelven las empresas encuentran los incentivos a innovar e invertir. Entonces la política productiva tiene que estar, y política industrial, íntimamente atada a los desafíos de la internacionalización. Y en eso creo fallamos fuertemente. Acá y aún en países más abiertos de Latinoamérica que todavía en gran medida tienen separados estas dos áreas de política, internacionalización y el resto de la política productiva. Pero acá principalmente. Si preguntan acá política productiva, que no siempre cuando uno dice política productiva, enseguida vienen los ecos de la vieja forma de hacer política. Acá voy a abrevar en gran medida todo lo que les voy a decir acá, tiene algún condimento propio, pero en gran medida es atribuible a Rodrik, o al menos el Rodrik de hace unos años. Una de las principales contribuciones es destacar un poco de alguna forma este contraste. Hay un enfoque tradicional que es elegir sectores y darles incentivos tributarios y quizás financieros, crediticios. Esto se hace en general a través de regímenes de excepción tributaria, que en general son fáciles de implementar, aún sin capacidades estatales, fáciles de implementar mal, beneficios difíciles de remover por la captura. Lo vemos en el caso del régimen de Tierra del Fuego, donde claramente ante toda evidencia de su inefectividad no se puede remover. Alto costo fiscal. Bajo este enfoque de política, que es el que todo el mundo tiene en la cabeza, la elección de sectores es crucial, porque una vez que uno elige el sector, le pone un régimen de excepción impositiva, después no se lo saca más. Compromete recursos a futuro eternamente o en el largo plazo. Y es verdad, una crítica que siempre se le hizo a esta forma de hacer política es que faltan capacidades estatales para identificar quiénes son los sectores beneficiarios. Pero hay otra forma de hacer política productiva, y política industrial, llamémosle, No es que esté excluyente con la anterior, no es que no se tiene que hacer nada en lo anterior, pero quiero destacar la diferencia y la desproporción en cómo se aplican estos dos tipos de políticas, que tiene que ver con la necesidad de los sectores productivos de contar con insumos públicos, que son complementarios a sus esfuerzos de competitividad. Como insumos públicos, como esfuerzos de promoción comercial, quizás promover una marca sectorial en el exterior, formación para el trabajo, una infraestructura de calidad para tener una calidad que se pueda exportar, financiamiento para la exportación. O sea, hay un montón de áreas, bienes públicos de especificidad sectorial que hacen a la competitividad de los sectores. En general se aplican a través de programas. Estos programas, implementarlos, requiere capacidades estatales que se construyen con continuidad, que muchas veces esa continuidad no se provee, se discontinúan estos programas. Tienen la ventaja de, a diferencia de tener un sunset clause incorporado, embebido, porque se construye un bien público y se construyó, ahí está, no se perpetúa. Tienen mucho menor costo fiscal. Yo les quiero dar un ejemplo. La Agencia Nacional de Promoción de Exportaciones en Argentina, promoción de la inversión y las exportaciones. El principal actor que uno pensaría, la punta de lanza de esta estrategia de hacer una economía más competitiva, productiva, que llegue al exterior, tiene un presupuesto de no más de $10 millones por año. 10 millones de dólares por año. El régimen de Tierra del Fuego cuesta $1.000 millones por año. 10 contra 1.000, 100 a 1. Es esta desproporción la que es destacable. Es uno solo, pero de nuevo, es la agencia principal, tendría que ser el actor principal, yo diría líder en esta estrategia. Esa es la diferencia. En estos casos, este es un término acuñado por Dani Rodrik, que siempre uno tiene que elegir sectores, en el fondo siempre está eligiendo sectores. Porque si uno tiene que construir un laboratorio, es el laboratorio que le va a servir a un sector y no al otro. Pero esa elección de sectores es menos problemática. ¿Por qué? Porque la priorización que uno haga es modificable. No está este asunto de que comprometa recursos a futuro eternamente. Entonces es menos preocupante. Uno elige hoy un sector al que priorizar, mañana elegirá otro. Es menos susceptible de captura. Y también el problema de, ¿cuál es quién va a elegir sectores? ¿Cómo sabe el Estado elegir sectores? Este approach un poco tiene en cuenta que el sector público no sabe todo y entonces enfatiza mucho la necesidad de interacción público-privada, de mecanismos donde se reciben las necesidades del sector privado, se identifican y se prioriza a partir de eso. Y la necesidad de coordinar la provisión de todos estos insumos. Entonces, si quizás esta es la última filmina que tengo, si pensamos cómo, es que trato de de una forma fácil pensar cómo sería la estructura de esta política productiva o política industrial atada a la internacionalización, les propongo mirarlo de esta forma. A la izquierda tienen distintas áreas de política que tienen que ver directamente con los desafíos de la internacionalización. Facilitación de comercio, negociaciones comerciales, promoción comercial, promoción de la calidad, financiamiento exportador, infraestructura para la exportación. Son todas estas áreas que son distintas agencias públicas o departamentos del sector público, incluso del sector privado, que tienen roles importantes para la provisión de estos bienes públicos, que tienen que estar coordinados en sí. Por ejemplo, en promoción comercial, esta agencia de la que les hablo, que quizás ni siquiera la conocen algunos de ustedes, tiene que estar coordinada con las embajadas. Promoción de la calidad, todos los actores tienen que estar coordinados en un sistema nacional de calidad. Yo traté en mi paso por la función pública de lograr que el sistema de calidad trabaje coordinadamente. Y por el lado derecho, y en estos últimos meses ha habido avances fuertísimos en facilitación de comercio. Facilitación de comercio también involucra aduana, Secretaría de Comercio, SENASA, INAL. Se ha avanzado mucho, quizás en negociaciones comerciales, pero en el resto estamos para atrás. A la derecha están las típicas políticas, áreas de política productiva que uno se imaginaría. ciencia, tecnología e innovación, extensionismo tecnológico, formación laboral. Nombro algunas, hay muchísimas más. No quiero que me digan después no nombraste tal. Estoy queriendo organizar un poco la idea. Son también áreas en sí que necesitan estar organizadas. Todas ellas son áreas de política que proveen bienes públicos relevantes para la competitividad. Que quizás el punto principal, además de que funcionen hoy, todas estas áreas están para atrás, no solo desfinanciadas, sino sin un trabajo de tratar de optimizar, aún con menores recursos, la capacidad de delivery que tienen de políticas. Pero principalmente tienen que estar reorientadas a la internacionalización. Volviendo a lo que les dije antes, de nada, no tiene mucho impacto tener apoyo a la innovación si la empresa después no está pudiendo resolver los problemas de internacionalización. Y creo que eso ha sido, aún en gobiernos que han apoyado mucho la política productiva, creo que esta parte se ha desatendido. Y entonces por eso la política productiva o incluso la política industrial no ha sido efectiva. Y todas estas áreas de política, tanto digamos, el front-end de la internacionalización como las políticas productivas más de base, tienen que estar coordinadas en el marco de estrategia, en el marco de una coordinación público-privada, una cooperación público-privada y coordinadas. Y esto se puede hacer, parece fantasía. Ustedes quizás me escuchan hablar y dicen, ¿de qué está hablando? Lo importante son los impuestos. Creo que acá está la clave de la política productiva. Yo he tenido oportunidad de organizar algunas de estas instancias de cooperación y se van logrando cosas. Es un base, entonces en una empresa ustedes tienen el área de comercialización, el área de finanzas, el área de producción. Y cada una tiene que hacer bien lo que hace y después todo eso tiene que estar coordinado. En la gestión pública falta esa coordinación. Es básico, no estoy hablando de planificación soviética. Es capacidad de gestionar proyectos que dependen de la acción de distintas agencias públicas en distintos ministerios. Es una dificultad, hay que organizarlo. Y se han organizado, y en muchos países han tenido programas para hacer esto, y aún ante la evidencia de éxitos, se han discontinuado ante cambios de administración. Y creo que eso es un problema, y conozco experiencias en Latinoamérica exitosas, en Colombia, en Uruguay, en Argentina. Quizás el único caso que tuvo más éxito es Perú con sus mesas ejecutivas, que incluso el gobierno en distintas administraciones han querido discontinuarlas, y por suerte fue el sector privado el que sale a defenderlas, a pedirle al sector público que esas instancias se preserven. Y entonces, bueno, quizás ya terminando mis segundos, este es el principal mensaje, que hay una forma de hacer política productiva, de gestionar la política productiva, que es posible y que quizás, si me permiten, hay un rol del sector privado en pedir al sector público una implementación de políticas en este sentido, la coordinación, la gestión de política productiva, que hoy no está presente. Y además es una agenda que es similar, es lo mismo esto para la industria, como les digo, para el agro, para los servicios, incluso para los servicios no transables de los que hablaba Dani, ¿no? La problemática de cómo organizar el Estado para hacer política productiva es común a todos estos sectores. Entonces, yo les quiero transmitir la posibilidad de una agenda positiva, común a sectores que en general siempre tienen una voz ante el sector público compartimentalizada. Acá hay una agenda que creo que sería efectiva, positiva, ofensiva y común a muchos sectores. Entonces, esto es a donde quiero llegar y creo que esto hace falta. Para terminar, entonces, el mundo está cambiando, los próximos años van a ser convulsionados e inciertos, nos exige estar atentos y desarrollar capacidad de respuesta ante eventualidades. Estoy diciendo obviedades, ¿no? Pero nuestro principal desafío de competitividad está puertas adentro. A pesar de todo esto que está pasando en el mundo, necesitamos tener una política productiva fuerte, bien definida, coordinada, y esa política productiva creo que tiene que tener como driver a los desafíos de internacionalización. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias, doctor Hallak. A continuación, pasamos a la ronda de preguntas y respuestas a los expositores, que estará coordinada por el doctor Gerardo Della Paolera, director ejecutivo de la Fundación Bunge y Born. Como señalé anteriormente, los asistentes por streaming pueden enviar sus preguntas a través del formulario que van a encontrar en la página.
Ahora sí. ¿Anda? ¿Se escucha? Bueno, buenas tardes. Llegamos casi al final de este excitante seminario del Boletín Informativo Techint sobre Industrialización, Comercio y Aranceles. Antes de lo que vamos a hacer es vamos a tomar, if you're okay, Dani y Juan Carlos, vamos a tomar una serie de preguntas, es un grupo de preguntas, 3 y 3 probablemente. Así las juntamos para que luego ustedes respondan, pero quería hacer simplemente una reflexión sobre, bueno, no está presente el primer speaker, y como historiador económico que enseño historia económica global, me interesó su enfoque neomercantilista. O sea, hay un enfoque neomercantilista muy interesante. Los americanos piensan que los chinos también tienen un enfoque neomercantilista, y en la historia, cuando vos tenías el enfoque mercantilista previos al laissez-faire, laissez-passer o el free trade o las corn laws de los ingleses, todo se resolvía a través de conflictos, no a través del sistema de precios, sino a través del conflicto. Entonces, me agrada estar entre dos optimistas porque la verdad que no soy tan optimista con respecto a cómo va a ser el outcome que se estaba explicando con respecto al primer speaker. Dicho esto, bueno, le paso las preguntas a quien quiere hacer una pregunta y, por favor, a quién se dirige. José María, acá. Y vamos a juntarlas. ¿Y a quién le vas a dirigir la pregunta?
Pregunta, un comentario para... ¿Está funcionando? Para Dani Rodrik, hola. Me quedé dando vueltas con la observación de qué es lo que podemos aprender de China en el momento actual y cómo trasladar ese aprendizaje en esta dicotomía entre autoritarismo y democrática. En un mundo probablemente mercantil, como que está describiendo Jerry, uno creería que los autoritarismos tienen alguna ventaja técnica. Las democracias, bueno, sabemos que son más complejas de ordenar y coordinar. Ahora, si pienso en las de América Latina en particular, y recuerdo que había un paréntesis en tu presentación que decía accountability, transparency, y supongo que eso supone rule of law, pienso en nuestros estados y no encuentro las capacidades para poder ordenar. Es decir, la colega Merrill Green pasó largos años estudiando estas capacidades estatales en América Latina y en otros países, y lo que encontramos es un equipamiento bastante débil, estados débiles, penetrados por intereses particulares, con poca capacidad de coordinación. Entonces, me gustaría que elabores un poquito más sobre este traslado de esta experiencia china a casos como los de los países latinoamericanos de la corrupción endémica.
Gracias. Pregunta Beatriz acá. ¿Y para quién?
I have a question for Dani Rodrik y tengo una pregunta para Juan Carlos.
Bueno.
For Dani, I mean, in this house, since the tradition of Roberto Rocca, Agostino, and Paolo, industrial policy is key. So I have read almost all your work, but I found a later article, 2025, where you speak about industrial policy for the 21st century. And there you say that manufacturing is key. You address all the challenges you said today. But today, it wasn't that clear. So what would be, in your view, an advisable industrial policy of the 21st century for Argentina and Brazil? And I say Argentina and Brazil because trade between Argentina and Brazil has a higher content of industrial manufactured goods that trade with the world. So that's a question for Dani. Y para Juan Carlos, bueno, me gustó mucho la énfasis de internacionalización. Una anécdota, pero súper breve, cuando yo estaba enseñando en MIT y escuchaba a Paul Krugman, la clase de Paul Krugman y Lester Thurow sobre desarrollo económico, un día le pregunté cuál es la característica diferencial de países desarrollados o subdesarrollados. Me dijo, quieren desarrollarse, generen 3 o 4 empresas globales. Bueno, Techint hacíamos nosotros el ranking de empresas argentinas que han invertido en el exterior y son multinacionales, y Techint siempre salía primera en la lista. Bueno, la internacionalización de Techint en México, por ejemplo, llevó de la mano en acero a varias proveedoras pymes de la Argentina. Entonces, la pregunta es, internacionalización no solo sobre exportación, sino a través de la inversión de empresas argentinas en el exterior.
Ok, acá ahora voy a leer, la pregunta que me pone muy nervioso, que está en la web. Entonces dice, thinking about the global position, for Dani, ok? Thinking about the global position of the United States and the fact that foreigners have a net positive position of $25 trillion, as you stated. It's not for you. Do you see any medium-term risk on capital controls in the U.S.? Salgo rajando, bueno, la última, ¿para quién, por favor? Sí. Y después, sí. ¿Para quién?
So my question is for Dani. Thank you for the great talk. So there seemed to me a bit of a logical jump in your argument, and that's between productivity and wages. So, as you know, in the United States, there was a very big gap that opened up between productivity and wages in the 1980s, which is when inequality rose very much in the US. So just as you pointed out with respect to tariffs, a tariff might increase the profits of a firm, but it's kind of another big step for them to therefore increase wages. And it seems to me that increasing productivity in a sector, it might on average sometimes raise wages, but it doesn't necessarily. And what was good about those manufacturing jobs in the past, I mean, they weren't good jobs in any sense of the work itself. They were good precisely in the sense that they paid well, basically only in the sense that they paid well and had good, nice benefits and so on. So it seems to me it's a question of distribution. To build a middle class is about distribution more than about the productivity per se. In the US, it was largely explained by the rise in inequality, and the stagnation of wages was primarily explained by policies and institutions like the declining real minimum wage, the decline in labor union power, and so on. So what role do you think that labor institutions and policies have in providing these kind of good jobs, as you call them?
Ok, y hay una pregunta para Juan Carlos, para así después, ¿o no? Bueno, te hago una pregunta, Juan Carlos. A mí me parece un poco relacionado con lo que José María estaba preguntando sobre esas capacidades realmente no estatales. Cuando yo veo todo ese cuadro de goals y objetivos sobre el final, primero, tenés un ejemplo de un fracaso, que es el INTI, ¿no? El Instituto Nacional de Tecnología, que es diferente que el INTA. Tenés el VICE, tuviste la Escuela de Exportación del Banco de Boston. O sea, hubieron 1000 cosas de ese tipo en la Argentina. Entonces, yo no sé si no hay un estadio anterior a básicamente esa agencia de promoción de exportaciones, si no tiene que ser un eslabón anterior a esto. O sea, tengo un poco, digamos, soy pesimista con respecto a esto. Creo que hay otras, la estabilidad económica, la desregulación, tener un tipo de cambio razonable, esas son las cosas que yo creo, y obviamente la educación. No sé, a mí tengo miedo de justamente un Estado que no es ni capaz de formalizar el 50% de la economía. ¿Cómo va a tener una agencia, digamos, especial para...? O sea, como que esa es la pregunta que te hago, ¿no? Es decir, no digo que el Estado no es necesario, no estoy en esa... Pero digo, ¿cuál es tu optimismo con respecto a eso? And that's it. So, if you want to go first, answering the questions, the capital controls also, please.
Thank you for all those questions. They would actually take a very long time to do them justice, but let me take them in reverse order. There was a question about the role of labor institutions, and that was, I think, rightfully the point was made that increases in productivity do not necessarily translate into wage gains and better jobs. In fact, historically, that was also true in manufacturing. That in the early industrial revolution, the wages stagnated, and it took quite a while for wages to increase, even though overall productivity was increasing. It was only after sort of labor organized and you got labor unions and government-mandated regulations on labor conditions and so forth that wages increased. So I do take that point. It's very important. I think the reason that I didn't say anything about that and just emphasize productivity is first, I do think that productivity is the sine qua non. That is, that it's a necessary condition, but it's not a sufficient condition. It's also because I think when we talk about better jobs and good jobs, at least in the US context, I'm not sure about whether that is true here or in Europe, is that there is a tendency to focus much more on government mandates and on bargaining issues rather than on the productivity dimension. And I think what the evidence suggests that that doesn't necessarily work. I mean, I think there are the example of France, for example, where the minimum wage is actually quite generous, and even though unions are not very, union membership is not very high, sectoral wage bargains are very common. That has created essentially kind of a very dualistic labor market that you've created. So those who have jobs have actually good jobs, but you have very high rates of unemployment among the youth or new entrants into the labor market. That's because those wage conditions or the demands of high minimum wages and wage conditions are not commensurate with the levels of productivity for entering jobs and new jobs. So I do think that if you want to have the labor market work well, you need both the fundamentals and the productivity. You need to transform what are essentially today very low productivity jobs into higher productivity jobs. But as you suggested, they need to be supported both by government regulations on work conditions as well as much better union worker representation. So that's a good point. Now, the interesting question about capital controls, it's interesting, you can see, progressively, U.S. becoming more and more like Argentina. First, it was the protection.
I call my broker.
Now that the capital controls are gone in Argentina, so actually, to be quite honest about it, maybe you'll just recoil in horror in what I'm about to say. But if you take the central diagnosis and I think I take for example, Robert Lighthizer's diagnosis centrally to be that the U.S. has been hurt by very large deficits, very large current account deficit. Of course, what's the flip side of it? It's in capital inflow. And I think, the argument would be then that, because of the central role of the dollar, the central role of the U.S. financial system, that essentially U.S. has turned into an exporter of finance and an importer of goods. And that's not a very good thing for the U.S. So it has comparative advantage in the wrong things. So, it's actually, if you wanted to fix that, what you want to fix is make your financial system less attractive to the rest of the world, which is actually put capital controls, inward capital controls. So there's actually much more economic logic for, to essentially force a current account realignment by taxing capital inflows into the United States. If everything worked like economists predict, that would sort of, essentially force a depreciation of the U.S. dollar, and then would fix the competitiveness problems on the current account. So that's actually is a better, policy mix than going about it through protectionism, which actually is not very effective. But will we actually get it or not? I mean, I don't know. There was a question about what might, industrial policy, a new industrial policy for the 21st century in countries like Argentina or Brazil might look like. I'm totally on board with everything that, Juan Carlos Hallak said about sort of the things that need to be done. I do think, however, my views on the centrality of manufacturing and therefore by implication of exports of manufacturing have changed over time because of this problem that I see that manufacturing has lost its ability to absorb a lot of labor. So, we have no choice. It's not a conclusion that I like. It's a conclusion that I'm driven out of, sort of by necessity. That is that there is the issue of, what are you going to do with the 80% of your workforce that is not employed in your tradable sectors, right? The answer that you're just going to create sort of very productive tradable exporting sectors and somehow it'll trickle down to the rest of the 80% of the workforce is not an attractive answer. It doesn't lead to both good economics. More importantly, it doesn't lead to good politics. You're not the kind of inequalities and labor market divisions that's going to create does not draw a desirable picture for any economy's future. That's why I say, yes, by all means, work on your sectors of strength, work on your sectors of potential comparative advantage, but you have to work, if you're going to create a middle-class society, that will have to come by increasing the productivity of your workers, largely disorganized and informal sectors, still in countries like Argentina. And that's a very different type of industrial policy, asking questions like, how can I increase productivity in sort of these very large, disorganized, largely informal, and largely non-traded sector? And that means helping with entrepreneurship, helping with appropriate technology, helping street vendors organize, helping healthcare and long-term care workers become more productive through better technology, different types of organizational structures. So it's a very different type of strategies, but it has to be much more central than the way that I was thinking about the problem maybe 10, 15 years ago. Finally, authoritarianism versus, again, China is the big, of course, case, but essentially the studies, systematic studies, or whether it is authoritarian countries systematically do better, tend to find that the answer is no. So there is no systematic evidence that authoritarianism provides an economic advantage to countries. And you look at the specific features that enable China to succeed in like the green industrial policies, it's not authoritarianism per se, but it's much more about a lot of competition among municipalities and the way that the central and local authorities have been able to combine state guidance with collaboration, with incentivizing private economic activity. And by the way, one reason that you might be very pessimistic about the Chinese economy moving into the most advanced sectors like AI is precisely because the Chinese system has become more authoritarian and much more centralized under Xi Jinping, and that's a real concern from. So I think I would say that for every one authoritarian country that has succeeded, I can cite 10 that have failed very miserably. And I think actually in Latin America, the performance of democracies, both in terms of how they manage macroeconomy, they respond to external shocks, has been generally better than of authoritarian countries, when they were under authoritarian regimes. But I think the final issue I will make, because that was directed that point about Wuhan, but on state capacity, I'd like to think about state capacity as something that you build and not something whether you have or not. It's really a question about priority. If you go back 30 years, you would never have thought that in Argentina or many other countries in Latin America, you have independent central banks that are sort of professionally autonomous and sort of, but because for certain periods, inflation became prioritized, there was institution building, you acquire that capacity. I think so it's really, state capacity is acquired, you're not born with. And there are a lot of parts of the, Argentinian economy or in public-private sector cooperation where I think things have worked in the past, whether it is development of agricultural technology, the adaptation. I think there have been some of those public R&D initiatives that have been very successful. Development of the wine industry at the local level in Mendoza and so forth has been sort of partly driven by public-private collaboration. So I think, this state capacity is something that is built when political leaders prioritize certain objectives. And that's, I think, the sense in which many of it's really a question of having the priorities and wanting to do it rather than saying, this is not that we don't have the capacity to do it.
Juan Carlos.
Bueno, primero contesto la pregunta de Betty de internacionalización o exportaciones. no distinguiría, yo por eso hablé de internacionalización en general, no distinguiría tanto, mientras lo importante es que fluya ese conocimiento sobre los mercados externos. El problema es cuando si todas se van y se van afuera, y eso es manifestación de un problema. Pero en la medida que ese conocimiento esté fluyendo y haya empresas que exporten y otras se van y se instalan afuera, es lo que más querés, que esa conexión entre el que está afuera y el que está dentro. Creo que todo eso es una sinergia positiva, no distinguiría mucho. Y bueno, my take en las capacidades estatales, yo con lo que dijo estoy 100% de acuerdo. Que las capacidades se construyen
Sabemos, sí.
Pero déjame primero decirte algo. Primero, no creo que haya una rivalidad entre una agenda y la otra. Entonces, que persigas la estabilidad macroeconómica, que persigas mejora tributaria, no te impide perseguir la otra agenda. Hay un punto donde puede haber un trade-off, que tenés que elegir recursos, dónde destinás recursos.
Yo no dije eso.
Pero, digo, una cosa no quita la otra.
No, tenés una, pero la otra es compleja, la que vos estás proponiendo.
Ahora voy a eso, ahora voy a eso. Pero lo que te quiero decir es que no compiten, al menos en gran medida no compiten esas dos agendas. Como dice Dani, es decisión política, de quiero esta agenda promoverla. Eso ya falla, paso número 1 ya falla. Vos mencionás las capacidades estatales en muchas agencias públicas. Es verdad que hay problemas, no te voy a decir que no. Yo hace poco hice una respuesta sobre el INTI. Yo estudié muchos casos, hice unos trabajos sobre distintas acciones que hizo el INTI. Me pareció una forma caricaturesca de describir los motivos, lo que hacía y los motivos por el que se le sacaba autonomía, que la autonomía quizás es secundario al punto, ¿no? El punto es si crees que esos bienes públicos los tenés que proveer o no. Eso sí está. El primer paso es eso. Pensás que son importantes esos bienes públicos que hay que proveer y no tenés. Lo segundo es, ha habido muchas instancias en donde, bien gestionados, hacen el delivery. Tiene problema, el sector público siempre es más difícil. Pero se puede hacer que trabajen mejor, han trabajado mucho mejor y en general trabajan mejor de lo que se piensa que trabaja, más allá de todos los vicios y problemas que pueda haber. Yo he visto las discusiones que hay. Cuando uno conoce los organismos, lo que hace es decir, sí, está bien, pero también hay toda otra parte que se ha construido esa capacidad. Es verdad que muchas veces no se construyen por temas que yo pensaría que son reversibles. La inestabilidad macroeconómica ha hecho mucho, los grandes vaivenes en orientación política han minado mucho esa capacidad. Pero que no tengamos la capacidad intrínseca de tener un Estado que hace más o menos un delivery de estas políticas relativamente bien, creo que no nos podemos resignar a no tener eso, porque esos bienes públicos y la coordinación de esos bienes públicos afectan la competitividad. O sea, si te resignás a eso, te resignás a una competitividad de los sectores, a una productividad general de los sectores, incluyendo los sectores no transables, también, porque los sectores no transables también dependen de esa coordinación, de esas políticas, en la construcción, en el comercio. También hay una agenda, si haces una agenda de temas a hacer, va a haber un montón de temas y decís, ¿por qué esto no se hizo? No se hizo porque no hay capacidad de gestión del Estado, gestión a nivel coordinación. Y eso hay tecnologías para hacerla, hay tecnologías que se han probado. La mayoría de las veces se hace mal, pero hay un conocimiento de cómo hacerlo bien. Falta un poco transmitir eso, las experiencias que más o menos han salido bien, se pueden hacer mejor. Lo increíble es que esa continuidad que se necesita para construir esas capacidades se pierde por negligencia. Ante cambios de gobierno, cambios de administración, estas instancias se desactivan, lo que sea, la forma que sea de hacerlas, desde una mesa de diálogo público-privado, incluso la agenda de desregulación, es alguna forma de esto. También, quizás escucha el sector privado, viene con... Es otra forma, quizás no la típica, pero es una forma también con una agenda confinada a un aspecto muy parcial. Porque esa misma lógica opera en distintos aspectos de la política productiva. Hoy cosas básicas no funcionan. Podrían funcionar muy fácil. Creo que solo ya con la convicción desde arriba de que eso es importante que funcione. Lo que tenemos para ganar es muchísimo, antes de pensar la parte a la que no vamos a llegar.
¿A una pregunta? Sí.
Sí, algún comentario para Dani. Comparto plenamente tus cifras que das en términos de la caída relativa del empleo industrial y también comparto plenamente en poner el foco de atención a los servicios no transables como un elemento fundamental en las fuentes de crecimiento. Pero levantando un poquito la cuestión industrial, ya que estamos dentro de la empresa Techint y todo lo demás, ¿qué nos dice la evidencia empírica en la Argentina? Y básicamente lo que nos está diciendo es que comparado con el pasado hubo profundos cambios en los modelos de organización de la producción y del viejo Fordismo integrado en las 4 paredes de la fábrica. Hoy hay cadenas de valor y externalización de actividades muy fuertes por parte del sector industrial. Y en la Argentina todavía la industria es quien ocupa la mayor cantidad de gente y ocupa más gente que el sector exportador. Y el empleo en el sector industrial tiene otra característica, es el que hoy paga mejor salario, un 25% arriba del promedio, el que tiene mayor nivel de formalidad, pero fundamentalmente es por cada puesto de trabajo que se crea en la industria, se crean 2,5 puestos indirectos de trabajo y es el sector que más puestos indirectos de trabajo tienen y que está asociado a este cambio de la forma de la organización de la producción. Así que en este sentido creo que, bueno, relativizo un poquito tu argumento en términos del empleo industrial.
But I think that the fact that you show the graph that you said that there is a fall in employment and it says deindustrialization, it is not deindustrialization because it means that industries are much more technology labor intensive. You see, I mean, so the elasticity of output, no, industrial output employment is more inelastic, but it doesn't mean that the industry is shrinking. You know, I mean,
I mean, so that's what I meant by the output employment disconnect.
Exactly,
so
but it's not.
It is true that I mean that's also true in the United States.
Exactly,
that if you look at at constant
mean,
prices, the share of manufacturing actually
has
not declined in the United
States.
It's a different
choice of technique.
So it is exactly. So I think that's a lot of the automation and then the use of capital, much greater skills, the new modes of organization, the supply chains have made manufacturing more productive.
Exactly.
That means you're using less labor. So that it's not something necessarily you want to discourage. What I'm suggesting is not that you want to make manufacturing more labor intensive because that's where you got the labor the productivity gains. But it does raise the conundrum. But it also means that there are multiple objectives here. You don't want to undercut your manufacturing innovation and its export potential, its quality, its competitiveness, and that's got to be part of your innovation and trade agenda without question. But you just have to bear in mind in a way that you didn't before that is not solving your other problem, your good jobs problem, in the way that it used to solve in the past. So that's the issue. I think, and we see this lack of recognition very much in the U.S. discussion because you say, by reinvigorating manufacturing, let alone that tariffs may not do it, but by focusing on manufacturing, I'm going to get national security, I'm going to get innovation, I'm going to get green transition, I'm going to rebuild the middle class. No, the last thing is not going to happen. And I think there's a version of that problem in other societies as well.
Bueno, thank you very much. Thank you. Gracias a todo el mundo. Gracias.
Muchas gracias, doctores Rodrik, Hallak y Della Paolera. Muchas gracias, señoras y señores, por asistir hoy al 20º Seminario Internacional del Boletín Informativo Techint. A quienes están aquí, los invitamos a pasar a un cóctel para finalizar. Muchas gracias. Buenas tardes.